Wyoming Territory, 1878. The blinding prairie sun baked the main street of Bitterroot, turning the thoroughfare into a shimmering mirage of dust and heat. Keegan McCoy lowered the brim of his Stetson against the glare, his keen blue eyes narrowing as he surveyed the small frontier town. It wasn't much: a general store, blacksmith, 2 saloons, and a smattering of other weathered buildings. But after 3 months driving cattle across the open range, even this humble outpost looked like civilization. At 24, Keegan had already spent 6 years as a cowhand, moving from ranch to ranch, never staying in one place longer than a season. The West had taught him one truth above all others: a man was better off alone. Companions died of fever, were crushed by stampeding cattle, or caught stray bullets in the endless disputes over water and grazing rights. Attachment was a luxury the frontier didn't afford. "You coming, McCoy?" called Silas, one of the older hands from the cattle drive. "First rounds on the trail, boss." Keegan nodded, patting the dappled gray gelding beneath him. "Go on ahead. Need to see the Tempest here." The other cowhands whooped and hollered as they dismounted in front of the larger saloon, the Silver Dollar, their boots hitting the ground in clouds of dust. They'd been paid that morning, and most would be broke by sunrise, spending their hard-earned money on watered-down whiskey, rigged card games, and women whose smiles lasted exactly as long as the dollars did. Keegan had different plans for his wages. He'd add them to the leather pouch sewn inside his saddle bag, now containing nearly 4 years of careful saving. Someday, that money would buy him a small parcel of land far from everyone. No boss to answer to, no partner to lose, no civilization encroaching on his freedom. Just him, some decent grazing land, and enough cattle to sustain himself. The livery stable at the end of the street beckoned with the promise of shade and water for his horse. As Keegan dismounted and led Tempest toward it, he noticed the weathered church across the way. Its white paint had long since surrendered to the elements, peeling away to reveal gray wood beneath. The bell tower stood crooked, as if perpetually leaning away from the prairie wind, but what caught Keegan's attention wasn't the building itself. It was the sound drifting through its open windows, a piano, played with such skill and feeling that it seemed impossible in this dusty corner of nowhere. The melody floated across the street, clear as spring water, complex and delicate, yet somehow powerful enough to rise above the town's ambient noise. Before he realized what he was doing, Keegan had stopped walking. Tempest nickered softly, nudging him with a velvety muzzle, but Keegan barely noticed. The music pulled at something deep within him, memories of his mother playing hymns on their family's small piano back in Missouri before the fever took her when he was 12. Before his father had dragged him west with nothing but bitterness and a wagon of meager possessions. "Never heard playing like that in Bitterroot before," said the livery owner, a grizzled man with a pronounced limp who'd appeared in the stable doorway. That would be the new schoolteacher, arrived on the stage last week. Keegan cleared his throat, embarrassed to be caught standing transfixed in the middle of the street. "Just surprised to hear a piano that's actually in tune," he muttered, leading Tempest forward again. Most frontier saloon pianos sound like they're being played with hammers. "Miss Abigail Gardner," the liveryman continued, unperturbed by Keegan's gruff response. 20 years old and educated back east. Town council practically fell over themselves hiring her. Last teacher left after 2 months, couldn't handle the isolation. He chuckled. "Betting pools already started on how long this one'll last." Keegan handed over Tempest's reins. "Full grain, proper rub-down, and check his front left shoe. Think it might be loose." He placed coins in the man's palm, deliberately overpaying. "And an extra measure of grain. He's earned it." As the liveryman led Tempest away with a nod, Keegan found himself glancing back toward the church. The music continued, shifting to something he didn't recognize, not a hymn, but something complex that made his chest tighten with unexpected emotion. "Fancy yourself some culture, cowboy?" The liveryman had reappeared, amusement in his rheumy eyes. "Church doubles as the schoolhouse. Teacher practices after lessons end." "Just making sure my horse is taken care of," Keegan replied stiffly, adjusting his hat. "I'll be back tomorrow." "Suit yourself," the older man shrugged. "But if you're curious, Reverend Palmer has been inviting folks to come hear her play on Sunday evenings. Says music might civilize some of the rougher elements in town." He eyed Keegan's trail-worn appearance meaningfully. Keegan grunted noncommittally and turned away, intending to join his fellow cowhands at the saloon. But his feet carried him across the street instead, drawn by the music that seemed to hook into his very core. He found himself at the church steps, reluctant to enter but unable to walk away. Through the open door he could see her. Slender fingers moved across the keys of an upright piano positioned near the pulpit. Her back was straight, her posture perfect as she swayed slightly with the music, lost in the composition. Honey blonde hair was swept up into a neat arrangement, revealing the graceful curve of her neck. Her dress was simple but well-made, pale blue cotton with white trim, modest yet undeniably feminine. Keegan stood frozen, one boot on the bottom step, feeling acutely aware of his trailed dust, his worn clothing, the stubble on his jaw, and the calluses on his hands. He had no business approaching someone like her, someone whose elegant movements spoke of refinement and education. The music crescendoed, filling the small church with sound that seemed impossible from such a modest instrument. Then, as if sensing his presence, she stopped abruptly and turned. Keegan found himself staring into eyes the color of summer sage, a clear, luminous green that widened with surprise at the sight of him. For one suspended moment, they simply looked at each other across the empty church, the final notes of her music still hanging in the air between them. "I'm sorry," he said finally, his voice rough from trailed dust and disuse. "Didn't mean to disturb you, ma'am." A smile bloomed on her face, not the practiced, commercial smile of saloon girls, but something genuine that transformed her already pretty features into true beauty. "You didn't disturb me at all," she said, her voice melodious even in speech. "Though I admit I'm not accustomed to having an audience in Bitterroot, most people here seem to view music as a frivolous luxury." "It's not frivolous," Keegan said before he could stop himself. He trailed off, unable to articulate what her music had stirred in him. "Necessary," she suggested, her head tilting slightly. "At least I've always thought so. I'm Abigail Gardner, by the way." "The new schoolteacher." "Keegan McCoy," he replied, touching the brim of his hat reflexively. "Just passing through with a cattle drive." "Well, Mr. McCoy, since you've already braved coming this far, would you like to hear the rest of the piece?" "Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major," she added, as if the name would mean something to him. It didn't, but Keegan found himself nodding anyway, removing his hat as he reluctantly stepped fully into the church. "If you don't mind playing for a trail-worn cowboy, Miss Gardner." "Music is for everyone, Mr. McCoy," she said, turning back to the piano. "That's something they taught us very firmly at the conservatory. Besides," she added with another smile that made something twist in Keegan's chest, "it's nice to play for someone who actually stops to listen." As she began to play again, Keegan sank into the nearest pew, his hat clutched awkwardly in his hands. The melody wrapped around him, pulling him into a world he'd long forgotten existed. A world where beauty could be created from nothing but human skill and emotion, where something other than survival mattered. In that moment, as the sun slanted golden through the church's simple windows and Abigail's music filled the sacred space, Keegan McCoy's carefully constructed solitude developed its first hairline crack. The next morning found Keegan in an unfamiliar state, standing before the cracked mirror in his rented room above the general store, attempting to tame his dark hair into some semblance of order. He'd already shaved, nicking himself twice in the process, and had put on his cleanest shirt, one he usually saved for towns with actual lawmen, where appearing respectable might keep him from being mistaken for a troublemaker. "You're being ridiculous," he muttered to his reflection. The schoolteacher had merely been polite to a stranger who'd appreciated her music. She'd probably already forgotten him. Besides, what was he hoping for? He'd be riding out with the herd in 3 days, continuing north to the railhead in Montana Territory. Still, he couldn't shake the memory of those green eyes, or the way the final notes of her nocturne had hung in the air like a question he couldn't answer. Disgusted with himself, Keegan jammed his hat onto his head and clattered down the external stairs to the street below. The morning was already warm, promising another scorching day. Most of his fellow cowhands would still be sleeping off their excesses from the night before, giving him blessed solitude for breakfast at the small cafe next to the general store. As he rounded the corner, however, he nearly collided with a figure hurrying in the opposite direction. His hands shot out instinctively to steady the person, and found themselves grasping the slender shoulders of Abigail Gardner. "Mr. McCoy," she exclaimed, looking up at him with those remarkable eyes. Today she wore a dress of soft yellow that reminded him of prairie sunflowers, her honey-blonde hair partially covered by a modest bonnet. In her arms she carried a stack of books. "Miss Gardner," he managed, quickly releasing her and stepping back. "I apologize, wasn't watching where I was going." "Neither was I," she admitted with a small laugh. "I'm trying to organize the schoolroom before classes begin next week, and I'm afraid I was mentally cataloging what else I need rather than paying attention to my surroundings." Keegan noticed one of her books had fallen in their collision. He stooped to retrieve it, a worn volume of poetry by someone named Tennyson. "Allow me to carry these for you," he offered, surprising himself. "Least I can do after nearly knocking you down." A becoming flush colored her cheeks. "That's very kind, but I wouldn't want to impose. You must have business to attend to." "Nothing that can't wait," Keegan said truthfully. The cattle were grazing on rented pasture outside town, watched over by the younger hands. The horses were being seen to at the livery. His only plan had been breakfast, followed by resupplying his trail provisions. Abigail studied him for a moment, then nodded. "In that case, I'd be grateful for the help." "The church is just down." "I remember," Keegan cut in, then immediately regretted his eagerness. "I mean, I saw it yesterday." Her smile suggested she knew exactly what he meant. "Of course." They fell into step together, Keegan carrying her stack of books while Abigail pointed out landmarks in the small town. Though he'd been through Bitterroot twice before on cattle drives, he'd never paid much attention to its history or the people who called it home. "Most of these buildings went up after the Army established the fort 10 miles east," she explained. "Though the settlement itself is older, started as just a trading post back in the 1850s. "You seem to know a lot about it for someone who just arrived," Keegan observed. "Reverend Palmer provided me with quite the historical overview," she admitted. "I think he was trying to impress upon me the importance of my position. According to him, bringing education and culture to the frontier is nothing short of a divine mission." There was a hint of amusement in her voice that made Keegan glance at her. "You don't sound entirely convinced." "Oh, I believe education is vital," she replied seriously. "But I'm not so arrogant as to think I'm bringing civilization to the unwashed masses. These people have built lives here against incredible odds. They have their own wisdom, their own skills." She glanced up at him. "Like you, Mr. McCoy, I imagine driving cattle across hundreds of miles of open country requires knowledge and abilities I can't begin to comprehend." Keegan felt warmth spread through his chest at her assessment. "It's just a job, ma'am." "As is teaching," she countered, "though I hope it might be more than that in time." They reached the church and Abigail pushed open the door. Inside, the space had been transformed since yesterday. The pews had been pushed to one wall, and several rows of simple desks now occupied the center of the room. A larger desk stood at the front, near the piano. "The children will come during the week, and on Sundays we'll move everything back for services," Abigail explained, directing him to place the books on her desk. "It's not ideal, but it's what we have." Keegan set down the books, looking around at the improvised schoolroom. "How many students will you have?" 23, ranging from 6 to 16, she said, removing her bonnet and hanging it on a peg by the door. "Some will only come when they can be spared from ranch work or other duties." There was a trace of concern in her voice. "I'm hoping to convince their parents that education is worth the sacrifice." Keegan thought of his own spotty schooling, abandoned entirely after his mother died and his father dragged him west. "It is," he said quietly. "Though it's hard to see that when there's work to be done and mouths to feed." Abigail regarded him thoughtfully. "Did you have much schooling, Mr. McCoy?" "Enough to read, write, and cipher," he replied with a shrug. "My mother taught me some before she passed. After that, there wasn't much time for books." "I'm sorry about your mother," Abigail said softly. Then, with a gentle smile, "though she must have taught you well. You have an ear for music, at least." Keegan shifted uncomfortably under her gaze. "Just because something speaks to you doesn't mean you understand it." "Understanding comes in many forms," she said. "Technical knowledge isn't the only kind." She moved to the piano, running her fingers lightly over the keys without pressing them. "Sometimes feeling is its own form of understanding." The morning light streamed through the church's simple windows, catching in her honey-colored hair and illuminating her profile. Keegan was struck again by how out of place she seemed in this rough frontier town, like a rare, delicate blossom somehow taking root among the hardy prairie grasses. "Will you play again?" he asked, the words escaping before he could consider them. Abigail turned, surprise evident on her face, followed by pleasure. "Now." Keegan nodded, suddenly unable to speak past the tightness in his throat. Without another word, she settled onto the piano bench and began to play. This piece was different from yesterday's, brighter, more dynamic, with rippling passages that made Keegan think of sunlight dancing on water. He remained standing, transfixed, as the music filled the room. When the final notes faded, Abigail looked up at him with an expression he couldn't quite interpret. "Mendelssohn," she said, "songs without words, it always makes me think of conversations we can't quite put into language." "It's beautiful," Keegan said simply, because there were no other words adequate for what he'd experienced. "Thank you," she rose from the bench. "Now I've taken up enough of your morning, Mr. McCoy. I'm sure you have matters to attend to." "Keegan," he said impulsively, "my name is Keegan." Her smile deepened. "Keegan, then." "And I'm Abigail to my friends." She tilted her head slightly. "I hope we might become friends despite your brief stay in our town." "I'd like that," he said, surprising himself with his sincerity. As he stepped back out into the harsh sunlight of the main street, Keegan was struck by a disorienting realization. For the first time in years, he was reluctant to leave a town behind. The next 2 days developed a pattern that both delighted and unsettled Keegan. Each morning, after checking on the herd and horses, he would find himself walking toward the church. Each time he told himself it was just to hear the music, that unique beauty so rare on the frontier. But the truth, which he barely acknowledged even to himself, was that he was equally drawn to the musician. Abigail always welcomed him with genuine pleasure, often pausing in her preparations to play a piece or two. Sometimes they talked afterward, about books she thought he might enjoy or his experiences on the trail. He found himself sharing stories he'd never told anyone, about the majestic lightning storm he'd witnessed on the plains of Kansas, or the time he'd stumbled upon a hidden valley in Colorado filled with wildflowers no one had named. In turn, she told him of her childhood in Boston, her education at a prestigious women's college, and her decision to come west despite her family's objections. "My father wanted me to marry his business partner's son," she explained on the third morning, as they sat on the church steps sharing coffee from her tin pot. "A suitable match that would have secured my future in Boston society." "Why didn't you?" Keegan asked, genuinely curious. The life she described, of concerts and libraries, secure homes and cultural refinements, seemed impossibly luxurious compared to the hardships of the frontier. Abigail looked out across the dusty Main Street, her gaze distant. "Because it would have been a life without purpose, without meaning. I would have been an ornament, not a person in my own right." She turned to him, her eyes clear and direct. "I wanted more. I wanted to make a difference. By teaching frontier children their letters." There was no mockery in his tone, only a desire to understand. "By helping them see possibilities beyond what they know," she corrected gently. "The West isn't just about survival, Keegan. It's about building something new, something better than what came before. But that requires more than just strong backs and brave hearts. It requires minds that can imagine alternatives, souls that can appreciate beauty." She smiled. "Like yours." Keegan nearly choked on his coffee. "Mine." "Don't look so shocked," she laughed. "You think I haven't noticed how you listen when I play, how you see things others miss?" She gestured toward the distant mountains. "Yesterday you pointed out how the light changes their color throughout the day. Most people here look at those mountains and see only obstacles or boundaries." "Or grazing land," Keegan added wryly. "Exactly, but you see beauty too." She touched his arm briefly, sending a jolt through him that had nothing to do with the coffee. "That's rarer than you think." Keegan looked down at his rough hands, suddenly acutely aware of all the ways he didn't belong in her world, despite her kind words. "I leave tomorrow," he said abruptly. "The herd needs to reach the Montana railhead before the first snow." Abigail's expression faltered for just a moment before she composed herself. "Of course, I've been selfishly keeping you from your preparations." "No," Keegan said quickly. "That's not what I meant, He struggled to find the right words. "These mornings have been unexpected." "A pleasant diversion from the trail," she suggested, her tone light but her eyes searching his. "More than that," he admitted, unable to fully explain even to himself what these brief hours in her company had come to mean. How could he tell her that her music had awakened something in him he'd thought long dead, a capacity for beauty, for connection? That her conversation had made him question the solitary future he'd been so certain he wanted. Before he could find adequate words, the church door opened behind them, revealing Reverend Palmer, a thin man with kind eyes and a perpetually worried expression. "Ah, Miss Gardner and Mr. McCoy, isn't it? One of the drovers passing through," the Reverend smiled benignly. "I'm glad to see our new teacher making friends, but I'm afraid I must borrow her for a meeting with the town council. There's been some concern about the curriculum." He lowered his voice as if sharing a confidence. "Some of the ranchers' wives are worried about too much emphasis on arts rather than practical subjects." Abigail rose gracefully, brushing dust from her skirt. "I'll be right there, Reverend." As the older man retreated inside, she turned back to Keegan. "Will I see you this evening? The Reverend has arranged a small musical gathering, just a few pieces to introduce me to the community." Keegan hesitated. The thought of seeing Abigail surrounded by the townspeople, respectable merchants and ranchers in their Sunday best, with their settled lives and permanent homes, made him uncomfortably aware of his transient status. What place did a drifting cowboy have in such a gathering? Yet the hope in her eyes made refusal impossible. "I'll be there," he promised. Her answering smile stayed with him throughout the day as he checked the herd purchased supplies for the journey north and confirmed their departure plans with the trail boss. "We ride at first light," Hudson, the weathered trail boss, reminded him. "No exceptions, McCoy, even for pretty schoolteachers." The older man's knowing look made Keegan flush. "I'll be ready," Keegan said stiffly. Hudson's leathery face creased in a rare smile. "Been driving cattle with you for 3 seasons now. Never seen you give a second glance to any woman in any town we've passed through." He struck a match against his boot and lit a cigarette. "Must be something special about this one." Keegan didn't answer, but as he walked back toward town in the gathering dusk, he couldn't deny the truth of Hudson's observation. There was something special about Abigail Gardner, something that had pierced the careful armor he'd built around himself since his mother's death and his father's subsequent descent into bitterness. The church was already filling with townspeople when Keegan arrived, having done his best to make himself presentable. He'd shaved again, polished his boots, and worn his one good shirt, a dark blue cotton that his trail mates teased was his funeral shirt, since he only wore it on the most solemn occasions. He slipped into a back pew, acutely aware of the curious glances from Bitterroot's permanent residents. The women wore their finest dresses, the men their least worn shirts and jackets. Children had been scrubbed to a shine, their hair slicked down with water or pomade. Even in this small frontier town, Abigail's musical performance was clearly considered an event worth dressing for. The Reverend stood at the pulpit, welcoming everyone and introducing their new teacher with effusive praise. And then Abigail appeared, walking to the piano in a dress Keegan hadn't seen before, a deep green that matched her eyes, with subtle embroidery at the collar and cuffs. Her honey blonde hair was arranged more elaborately than usual, with small white flowers woven into the braids. She looked, Keegan thought with a pang, like she belonged on a concert stage in Boston or New York, not in this rough-hewn church with its uneven floors and patched windows. But when she began to play, all such thoughts fled. The music was different from what she'd shared with him in their private mornings, more accessible perhaps, but no less beautiful. She began with familiar hymns, encouraging the congregation to sing along, her smile warm and inclusive as even the most tone-deaf rancher joined in. Then she transitioned to folk songs, Barbara Allen, Shenandoah, The Water is Wide, songs that spoke of love and loss, of journeys and homecomings. Her clear soprano voice lifted above the piano accompaniment, filling the church with emotion that had nothing to do with technical skill and everything to do with heart. Keegan sat transfixed, barely breathing, as she sang words that seemed meant for him alone. "The water is wide, I cannot cross over. Neither have I wings to fly. Give me a boat that can carry 2. And both shall row, my love and I." When the final note faded, there was a moment of profound silence before the congregation erupted in applause. Women dabbed at their eyes, men cleared their throats gruffly, and children stared wide-eyed at the teacher who had revealed this unexpected gift. As the audience began to disperse, forming a line to thank Abigail personally, Keegan slipped outside. The night air was cool against his flushed face as he leaned against the church wall, trying to make sense of the emotions churning within him. He had come to this town expecting nothing more than a few days' rest before continuing the long drive north. Instead, he had found, a woman whose music had awakened dormant parts of his soul, a glimpse of a life he could never have, a connection that would only make his inevitable departure more painful.
Keegan.
He turned to find Abigail standing in the church doorway, her figure silhouetted against the warm light from inside. She stepped toward him, her expression a mixture of concern and something else he couldn't quite name. "You're leaving," she said. It wasn't a question. "At first light," he confirmed, his voice rougher than he intended. She nodded, looking down at her hands. "I thought you might slip away without saying goodbye."
I wouldn't do that, Keegan said, then admitted. Though I considered it might have been easier.
"Easier isn't always better," Abigail said softly. She moved closer, close enough that he could smell the light floral scent that clung to her hair.
"I want to thank you."
"For what?" Keegan asked, genuinely puzzled. "For listening, not just to my music, but to me." She smiled, though there was sadness in it. "Do you know how rare that is?"
"To be truly heard."
Keegan thought of the long, empty nights on the trail, with only the stars and the occasional howl of a distant coyote for company. "I think I might," he said. They stood in silence for a moment, the sounds of the departing congregation fading as people made their way home through Bitterroot's darkened streets. "Will you come back this way?" Abigail finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "When the drive is over." The question caught Keegan off guard. In 6 years of driving cattle, he'd never retraced his steps intentionally. The West was vast, the trails many, and he'd prided himself on having no ties, no reasons to return anywhere. But standing before this woman whose music had somehow found the hidden chambers of his heart, Keegan suddenly wanted nothing more than to promise her, and himself, that this wasn't the end. "Yes," he said, the word a commitment he hadn't planned but couldn't deny. "When the snow closes the mountain passes and the work dries up, I'll come back." Abigail's smile bloomed, transforming her face. Without warning, she stood on tiptoe and pressed a soft, swift kiss to his cheek. "Then this isn't goodbye," she said. "It's just until winter." Before Keegan could respond, she had turned and hurried back into the church, leaving him standing in the darkness with the ghost of her kiss burning on his skin and a future suddenly more complex and more promising than it had been an hour before. The Montana railhead was chaos, bellowing cattle, shouting cowboys, cursing railroad men, and the constant, ear-splitting scream of steam whistles as trains arrived and departed. After 8 weeks on the trail from Wyoming, the herd had reached its destination, and the drovers were celebrating with the time-honored tradition of spending their wages as quickly and thoroughly as possible in the railroad town's numerous saloons and gambling halls. Keegan should have been relieved. The drive had been difficult. An early autumn storm had scattered part of the herd, a flash flood had nearly drowned 2 of the younger hands, and tensions between the trail boss and one of the more experienced drovers had threatened to erupt into violence more than once. But they'd made it with minimal losses and before the first heavy snow, which was all that really mattered in this line of work. Yet as he collected his wages and watched the cattle being loaded onto the stock cars bound for Chicago slaughterhouses, Keegan felt none of the usual satisfaction that came with completing a job. Instead, a restlessness had taken root in him, a discontent with the aimless pattern his life had followed for the past 6 years. "You headed to Diamond Lil's with the rest of us?" asked Silas, the older hand who had been with the outfit the longest. "Heard they got a new dealer who's actually honest, if you can believe that." Keegan shook his head. "Think I'll pass, need to figure out my next move." Silas gave him a shrewd look. "Still thinking about that schoolteacher back in Wyoming?" Keegan stiffened. He hadn't mentioned Abigail to anyone, but small trail outfits were like families. Nothing stayed secret for long. "Just weighing my options," he said evasively. "Hudson mentioned Rollins' spread is looking for hands to winter over," Silas offered. "Good pay, decent bunkhouse, could do worse." It was a generous suggestion. Winter work was scarce, and most outfits reduced their crews to the bare minimum during the months when cattle needed little tending beyond occasional feeding. A position at a place like Rollins meant shelter, regular meals, and a wage when many cowboys would be drifting from town to town, looking for odd jobs to tide them over until spring roundup. "I appreciate the tip," Keegan said, genuinely grateful for the older man's concern. But I think I'm headed back south. Silas raised his eyebrows. South, nothing there this time of year. Spring gathering won't start until March at the earliest. I made a promise, Keegan said simply. Understanding dawned in Silas' weathered face. Ah, well, in that case, he clapped Keegan on the shoulder. Good luck to you, McCoy. Hope she's worth the winter ride. As Silas walked away to join the others heading for Diamond Lil's infamous saloon, Keegan turned toward the livery where Tempest was stabled. The gray gelding nickered in recognition as Keegan approached his stall. Ready for another long ride, old friend, Keegan murmured, stroking the horse's velvety nose. This time we're not following the herd, we're following something else entirely. The stable owner appeared, wiping his hands on a rag. Turning in for the night, or are you wanting him saddled? Need him ready to ride in an hour, Keegan replied. And I'll need provisions for the trail, 2 weeks' worth at least. The man's bushy eyebrows rose. Heading out now? There's a storm brewing in the mountains. Most sensible folk are hunkering down, not striking out. I've never been accused of being sensible, Keegan said with a wry smile. But I know the passes. If I push hard, I can make it through before the worst hits. The stable owner shook his head but didn't argue further. Your funeral, he muttered, moving to prepare Tempest's tack. Where you headed anyway? Must be important to risk a mountain blizzard. Keegan thought of green eyes and honey-blonde hair, of music that had awakened something dormant within him, of a kiss on his cheek that had felt like a promise. Bitterroot, he said. In Wyoming Territory. Bitterroot, the stable owner frowned. Ain't nothing there but a few buildings and a lot of dust. Keegan smiled. You're wrong about that. There's music there. The journey south was as grueling as Keegan had anticipated. The weather turned treacherous just as he crossed into Wyoming Territory, with sleet and freezing rain giving way to the first heavy snow of the season. The mountain passes were already growing dangerous, drifts accumulating in the shadowed areas where sunlight never reached. But Keegan pressed on, driven by a compulsion he didn't fully understand. All he knew was that for the first time in years, he had a destination that mattered, a place where someone might be waiting for him, might be wondering if he'd keep his word. The image of Abigail's face on that last night sustained him through the coldest watches. When he huddled beside small fires in sheltered hollows, Tempest standing patiently nearby with his saddle blanket thrown over his back for extra warmth. Keegan would close his eyes and hear her music, the Chopin Nocturne, the Mendelssohn Piece, the folk songs that spoke of love and longing. He reached the outskirts of Bitterroot 14 days after leaving the Montana railhead, his provisions nearly exhausted and both he and Tempest gaunt from the difficult journey. The town looked different in the grip of early winter, the streets muddy from melted snow, smoke rising from every chimney, the buildings hunched against the cold. Keegan headed straight for the livery, concerned about Tempest after their arduous ride. The stable owner recognized him immediately. Well, I'll be damned, the older man exclaimed. The cowboy who got stopped by the schoolmarms playing didn't expect to see you back this way. I said I would be, Keegan replied, dismounting stiffly. His body ached from too many hours in the saddle and too many nights sleeping on frozen ground. Tempest needs grain, a warm stall, and a good rub-down. He's had a hard journey. The liveryman nodded approvingly as he took the reins. I'll see to him personally. You look like you could use some tending yourself. Jensen's wife runs a boarding house just down from the general store. Nothing fancy, but the beds are clean and she cooks a decent meal. Keegan nodded his thanks, retrieving his saddlebags and bedroll. The school's still in the church, he asked, trying to sound casual. The liveryman's eyes twinkled. It is. Classes let out about an hour ago, but Miss Gardner often stays late. His expression grew more serious. Town's been good to her, mostly, though there's been some grumbling from a few of the ranchers about her fancy Eastern notions of education. Keegan frowned. What kind of grumbling? Nothing serious, the older man assured him. Just the usual resistance to change. Some folk think reading Shakespeare and learning about art history is a waste of time out here. Others appreciate having a teacher with real learning, he shrugged. You know how it is on the frontier. New ideas take time to settle in. Keegan did know. The West was built on tradition and practicality. Innovations were viewed with suspicion until they proved their worth in the harsh environment where survival often hung in the balance. A teacher who emphasized arts alongside practical subjects might well face resistance, especially from families who needed their children's labor more than they needed them to recite poetry. "She's still living at the Palmers?" Keegan asked, remembering that the Reverend and his wife had offered Abigail lodging when she first arrived. "Moved into the small cabin behind the church about a month back," the liveryman said. "Town council fixed it up for her, nothing grand, but it gives her her own space." He gave Keegan a knowing look. "If you're heading that way, might want to clean up first. Jensen's has hot water for washing." Keegan glanced down at himself, suddenly aware of his trail-worn appearance. 2 weeks on the road had left him filthy, unshaven, and smelling of horse and campfire smoke. Not exactly the return he'd imagined during those long, cold nights on the trail. "Thanks for the advice," he said, slinging his saddlebags over his shoulder. "I'll check back on Tempest later." An hour later, washed, shaved, and wearing the cleanest clothes he could salvage from his limited trail wardrobe, Keegan stood outside the church, his heart hammering with unexpected nervousness. Through the windows he could see a lamp burning, casting a warm glow into the gathering dusk. And faintly, he could hear the piano, the same beautiful, complex music that had first caught his attention months ago. Taking a deep breath, Keegan mounted the steps and opened the door. Abigail sat at the piano, her back to him, seemingly lost in the piece she was playing. She wore a dress of deep russet, the color of autumn leaves, and her honey-blonde hair was gathered in a simple knot at the nape of her neck. She hadn't heard him enter over the music, and for a moment Keegan simply stood there, letting the melody wash over him, filling the empty places inside him that had grown during their separation. When the piece ended, he spoke into the silence. "That was beautiful." Abigail's back straightened, her hands frozen above the keys. Slowly she turned, her eyes widening as she took in his presence. "Keegan," she breathed, her voice barely audible, "you came back." "I said I would," he replied simply. She rose from the piano bench, taking a step toward him before stopping, as if uncertain. "I wasn't sure. The winter came early this year, the passes were difficult," he acknowledged, "but not impossible." They stood looking at each other across the empty church, the distance between them both physical and filled with all the things that had remained unsaid during their brief acquaintance in the late summer. Then Abigail smiled, that radiant, genuine smile that had haunted Keegan's dreams for weeks, and closed the distance between them in quick steps. Without hesitation, she threw her arms around him in a fierce embrace. "I'm so glad," she whispered against his chest. "So very glad you're here." Keegan's arms encircled her automatically, the feel of her slender form against him both foreign and somehow right. He allowed himself a moment to breathe in the scent of her hair, lavender and something uniquely her, before gently setting her back. "I couldn't stay away," he admitted. "Your music, it followed me. All those miles north and then back again, I kept hearing it." Abigail's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "I've been playing for you," she confessed. "Every evening I would play and imagine you might somehow hear it wherever you were." She laughed softly, embarrassed. "Foolish, I know." "Not foolish," Keegan said, his voice rough with emotion. "I did hear it in a way." A comfortable silence fell between them, broken only by the faint crackling of the stove that heated the church. "How long will you stay?" Abigail finally asked, the question cautious, as if she feared the answer. Keegan had asked himself the same question repeatedly on the journey south. He had no permanent position, no home in Bitterroot, no clear plan beyond his determination to see Abigail again. The logical thing would be to winter here, perhaps find temporary work, and then move on when spring brought new opportunities elsewhere. But looking into Abigail's hopeful, guarded eyes, Keegan suddenly knew that logic had nothing to do with the choice before him. "As long as you'll have me," he said, the words a promise he hadn't known he was ready to make until they left his lips. Abigail's answering smile was like the sun breaking through winter clouds. "Well then, Mr. McCoy," she said, her formal address belied by the warmth in her voice, "you might be in Bitterroot for quite some time." The winter of 1878 proved to be one of the harshest in Wyoming Territory's memory. Snow piled in drifts taller than a man, temperatures plunged to bitter lows that froze water buckets solid inside homes, and wind howled across the prairie with enough force to take the breath from your lungs. For weeks at a time, Bitterroot was effectively isolated, with trails to neighboring settlements impassable except in the most desperate emergencies. Yet for Keegan McCoy, it was a season of unexpected warmth and discovery. He'd found work quickly, first helping the blacksmith, whose arthritis made the cold months especially difficult, and then as a general handyman for the town council. There were always fences to mend, roofs to repair, and as the winter deepened, snow to clear. The wages weren't much, but combined with his savings, they were enough to secure a small room above the general store and to keep Tempest in the livery's best stall. But the true richness of that winter had nothing to do with employment or lodging. It lay in the hours spent in Abigail's company, evenings by the stove in her small cabin, listening to her play the upright piano the town had provided for her personal use. Afternoons helping her prepare materials for her students, Sundays sitting beside her in church, his deep baritone joining her clear soprano during hymns. "You have a good voice," she told him after the first service they attended together, her eyes bright with pleasure. "You never mentioned you could sing." Keegan had shrugged, embarrassed by her praise. Never had much occasion to. Trail songs and lullabies for skittish cattle don't require much skill. "Nonsense," Abigail had replied firmly. "You have a natural ear. With some training you could." "Let's not get ahead of ourselves," Keegan had cut in, amused by her enthusiasm but wary of where it might lead. "I'm a cowhand, not a concert performer." Abigail had given him a considering look. "You're more than just your profession, Keegan. I wish you could see that." That conversation had stayed with him, making him wonder what else she saw in him that he couldn't recognize in himself. For so long he'd defined himself by his solitude, his independence, his ability to move on without looking back. But Abigail seemed to perceive something different, something of value that had nothing to do with his skills on horseback or his knowledge of cattle. As December gave way to January, and January to February, Keegan found himself changing in ways both subtle and profound. He began reading again, first the books Abigail lent him, then others he sought out on his own from the small collection in the church. He started writing letters to his uncle in Missouri, reestablishing a connection that had withered after his father's death years earlier. And most surprisingly, he began thinking about the future in terms of we rather than I. It happened so gradually that he hardly noticed. The shift from wondering where he would ride come spring to considering what opportunities might exist for both of them in Bitterroot or beyond. The realization that his plans now instinctively included Abigail should have terrified him. Instead, it felt like the most natural progression imaginable. Not that their growing relationship was without challenges. Bitterroot was a small town, and Abigail's position as the schoolteacher meant she lived under constant scrutiny. Though Reverend Palmer and his wife had given their tacit approval to the friendship by including Keegan in Sunday dinners and social gatherings, others in town were less enthusiastic about their unmarried teacher spending time with a drifting cowboy of unknown background. "Mrs. Hargrove suggested today that I might benefit from some guidance regarding appropriate companions for a young lady in my position," Abigail reported one evening in early March as they sat by the fire in her cabin. She rolled her eyes expressively. Apparently her nephew, a very respectable rancher from near Cheyenne, would be happy to call on me when he visits next month. Keegan felt a surge of jealousy, followed immediately by uncertainty. What right did he have to feel possessive? He had offered Abigail nothing but his company and his affection, no promises, no security, not even a clear declaration of his feelings. "Perhaps you should consider it," he said, striving for a neutral tone. "A rancher would be a good match for a schoolteacher, settled, respectable." Abigail set down the book she'd been reading aloud from and fixed him with a penetrating gaze. "Is that what you think I want, respectability and security at any cost?" "I think you deserve a man who can offer you more than an uncertain future," Keegan replied honestly. "Someone established, with prospects." "And what about love?" Abigail challenged. "Does that factor into your calculations at all?" The word hung between them, electric with possibility. In all their hours together, neither had spoken openly of love, though it had grown between them as surely as spring was now awakening beneath the melting snow. "Of course it does," Keegan said quietly. "But love isn't always enough, Abigail, not in this world." She rose from her chair and crossed to where he sat, kneeling before him so their eyes were level. It's enough for me, she said, her voice steady. If it's real, if it's true. Her hands found his, fingers intertwining. Is it, Keegan? Is what we feel for each other real? Looking into her earnest face, Keegan felt the last of his defenses crumble. The solitude he'd cultivated for years, the careful emotional distance he'd maintained from everyone around him, none of it had withstood the gentle persistence of Abigail Gardner and her music. Yes, he said simply, it's real. More real than anything I've ever known. Her smile was like sunrise. Then the rest is just details, she said, leaning forward to press her lips gently against his. The kiss was brief, almost chaste, but it sealed something between them, a commitment that went beyond words or practical considerations. When they parted, Keegan felt as though a weight had lifted from his chest, leaving room for hope to expand. I love you, Abigail Gardner, he said, the words coming easily now that the dam had broken. I think I started falling the moment I heard your music, I just didn't know it yet. And I love you, Keegan McCoy, she replied, her eyes shining. Even if Mrs. Hargrove thinks you're entirely unsuitable. They laughed together, the joy of their shared declaration momentarily overshadowing the practical questions that still loomed. But as the evening wore on and Keegan reluctantly prepared to leave, propriety demanded he not stay too late at her cabin. Regardless of their feelings, reality began to reassert itself. Spring's coming, Abigail said as they stood at her door, the snow's already melting in the low places. It was an observation, but Keegan heard the question beneath it. With spring would come renewed opportunities for ranch work, the beginning of the cattle drives, the return to the life he'd known before Bitterroot. Before Abigail, I'm not leaving, he said firmly, not unless you're coming with me. Relief flooded her features. I have a contract with the town council through June, she reminded him. Until the end of the school year. Then I'll be here until June, Keegan said simply, and after that we'll decide together what comes next. As he walked back to his rented room that night, beneath a sky brilliant with stars, Keegan marveled at how completely his life had changed in the span of a few months. The solitary cowboy who had drifted across the West, avoiding attachment and connection, had been transformed by a woman's music and her belief in him. For the first time since childhood, Keegan McCoy was planning a future with roots and possibilities, a future that included not just survival, but joy. Spring arrived in earnest by mid-April, turning the muddy streets of Bitterroot into rutted tracks that dried beneath an increasingly warm sun. The surrounding prairie burst into color as wildflowers emerged from the thawing soil, and birds returned from their winter migrations, filling the air with song. With the improved weather came increased activity. Ranchers who had been snowbound on their remote spreads made their way into town for supplies and socialization. The general store received its first major shipment since before Christmas, bringing new goods and, more importantly, mail that had been accumulating in Cheyenne for months. For Keegan and Abigail, the changing season brought both opportunities and challenges. Their relationship, which had deepened during the isolated winter months, was now subject to more public scrutiny and practical considerations. Keegan had continued his odd jobs around town, but such work wouldn't sustain him indefinitely. Several nearby ranches had offered him positions for the spring roundup, which would mean weeks away from Bitterroot. He declined them all, determined to find a way to remain close to Abigail while still earning a living. The solution came unexpectedly, during a conversation with Sam Jensen, the general store owner who was also Bitterroot's unofficial mayor. Town council's been talking about building a proper schoolhouse, Jensen mentioned one afternoon as Keegan helped him unload a wagon of supplies. That church arrangement was always meant to be temporary. Now that Miss Gardner's proven herself, we're thinking it's time to invest in something more permanent. Keegan set down a crate of canned goods. You have land picked out. Jensen nodded, that empty lot behind the livery. Council owns it and it's central enough for the town children. Ranchers' kids who ride in would have a place to leave their horses, too. He gave Keegan a speculative look. Problem is, we need someone who knows construction to oversee the project. Most of the men around here are either shopkeepers or ranchers, good with cattle and crops, not so much with building. I've done construction work, Keegan said, thinking of the winters he'd spent in Texas helping build ranch houses and barns between cattle seasons. Worked with a master carpenter for 2 years before I started driving cattle. Jensen's eyebrows rose. Did you now? Never would have guessed. He rubbed his chin thoughtfully. Council set aside funds for the project. Wouldn't be a fortune, but it would be steady work through the summer. Interested? Keegan felt a surge of excitement. Very, he said firmly. When would you want to start? As soon as possible, Jensen replied. School term ends in June, and we'd like the new building ready by September. He extended his hand. Consider yourself hired, mister. McCoy, I'll call a council meeting tomorrow to make it official. That evening, Keegan shared the news with Abigail as they walked along the creek that ran behind the town, the setting sun casting long shadows across the newly green grass. My own school building, Abigail exclaimed, her eyes wide with delight, with real desks and proper windows, and you're going to build it. Keegan nodded, warmed by her enthusiasm. It won't be fancy, but it'll be solid. 2 classrooms, an office for you, maybe even space for a small library. Oh, Keegan, that's wonderful, she squeezed his arm. But what about after, when the building is finished? It was the question that had been hovering between them for weeks. What would happen when her teaching contract ended, when the temporary work that kept him in Bitterroot was completed? Would they move on together? Would she remain while he sought work elsewhere? Neither option seemed ideal. I've been thinking about that, Keegan said slowly. What would you say to staying in Bitterroot? Permanently, I mean. Abigail stopped walking, turning to face him fully. Are you saying what I think you're saying? Keegan took both her hands in his. Jensen mentioned the town's growing. They're expecting the railroad spur to reach here within 2 years, which means more families, more children. He took a deep breath. And more need for building. Houses, businesses, maybe even a proper church someday. A carpenter, Abigail said thoughtfully. In a growing frontier town. With a respected schoolteacher wife, Keegan added, his heart racing, if she'll have him. Abigail's eyes widened. Keegan McCoy, are you proposing to me beside a muddy creek at sunset? I suppose I am, he admitted, suddenly nervous. It's not very romantic, is it? I should have waited, planned something special. It's perfect, Abigail interrupted, her eyes shining. Absolutely perfect, and yes, I will marry you. Relief and joy flooded through Keegan as he pulled her into his arms, his lips finding hers in a kiss that held all the promise of their future together. When they finally broke apart, both breathless and laughing, the last light of day was fading from the sky. I don't have a ring, Keegan said apologetically. Not yet. I don't need a ring, Abigail assured him, her face radiant with happiness. Just you and our life together. As they walked back toward town, hands linked and hearts full, Keegan marveled again at how completely his life had changed since that hot summer day when he'd first heard Abigail's music drifting from the church windows. The solitary drifter had found not just love, but purpose and belonging in the most unexpected place. The news of their engagement spread quickly through Bitterroot, met with reactions ranging from genuine delight to grudging acceptance. Reverend and Mrs. Palmer were among the first to offer their congratulations, followed by Jensen and his wife, who insisted on hosting an engagement dinner at their home. June wedding, Mrs. Palmer declared, already planning. After the school term ends, but before the summer heat is too oppressive, the church will be beautiful with wildflowers. Abigail glanced at Keegan, a question in her eyes. They hadn't discussed timing, but the suggestion felt right. June would be perfect, she agreed, if that suits you, Keegan. I'd marry you tomorrow if I could, he replied honestly, earning a chorus of appreciative sighs from the ladies present and good-natured laughter from the men. Not everyone in town was as supportive. Mrs. Hargrove made a point of expressing concern about the hasty nature of the engagement, while her circle of friends wondered aloud whether a former drifting cowboy could truly settle into respectable town life. They'll come around, Abigail assured Keegan after a particularly uncomfortable encounter at the general store. Once they see you're here to stay, that you're contributing to Bitterroot's future. Keegan wasn't so certain, but he was determined to prove himself worthy of Abigail's faith in him. He threw himself into the schoolhouse project, working from dawn to dusk drawing plans, ordering materials, and preparing the site. By early May, the foundation was laid, and the frame of the building began to take shape. Word of his skill spread quickly, and soon Keegan found himself fielding requests for other work, repairs to existing buildings, plans for new homes, even a commission to design and build a more imposing front for the general store. "Told you the town was growing," Jensen said proudly as they discussed the store expansion. "Railroad survey team confirmed last week they'll be laying track to Bitterroot by next summer. This place won't be the same in 5 years' time." The prospect both excited and unnerved Keegan. He wanted security for himself, and Abigail wanted their future to be bright. But part of him also cherished Bitterroot's small-town character, the close-knit community that had mostly welcomed him. "You're worried about change," Abigail observed one evening as they sat on the partially completed schoolhouse's porch steps, watching the sunset. She'd taken to bringing him dinner when he worked late, using the opportunity to see the progress on what would be her new domain. "Not worried exactly," Keegan said, wrapping an arm around her shoulders, "just thinking about what it means. More people, more buildings, more civilization." Abigail leaned into him. "Isn't that what the West is about? Taming the wilderness, building something new." "I suppose," Keegan acknowledged. "It's just that for so long I valued the emptiness, the freedom of open spaces." He smiled wryly. "Hard to believe I'm the same man who was planning a solitary cabin, as far from everyone as possible." "You're not the same man," Abigail said softly. "Neither of us is who we were when we met. That's what love does, it changes us, opens us to new possibilities." She placed a hand on his cheek, turning his face toward hers. "But it doesn't change everything. You'll always love the open spaces, Keegan. We'll make sure they're part of our life together." Her understanding eased something in him. "How did I get so lucky?" he murmured, pressing his forehead to hers. "It wasn't luck," Abigail replied. "It was music." They shared a smile at that, acknowledging the truth of her words. Without her piano playing, he would have ridden through Bitterroot without a second glance, continuing his solitary journey across the West. Instead, her music had stopped him in his tracks and opened a door to a life he'd never imagined possible. As May gave way to June, preparations for both the wedding and the completion of the schoolhouse's exterior moved into high gear. The women of the town, led by Mrs. Palmer and Mrs. Jensen, took charge of transforming the church for the ceremony, while Keegan worked double time to ensure the new building would be weathertight before he and Abigail departed for a brief honeymoon trip to Cheyenne. A week before the wedding, as Keegan was supervising the installation of the schoolhouse roof, a commotion in the street drew his attention. A group of riders had entered town, hard-looking men whose trail-worn appearance suggested they'd been traveling for some time. They headed directly for the Silver Dollar Saloon, with the exception of one man who dismounted before the general store. Something about the dismounting rider seemed familiar, though Keegan couldn't immediately place him. It wasn't until the man removed his hat, revealing a shock of graying red hair, that recognition hit with the force of a physical blow. Tobias McCoy, his father. Keegan nearly lost his footing on the ladder, catching himself at the last moment. He hadn't seen or heard from his father in almost 8 years, not since the bitter argument that had driven the final wedge between them when Keegan was 16. Last he knew, the elder McCoy had been drifting through Colorado, working mining claims with limited success. "You all right, boss?" called one of the workers, noticing Keegan's sudden stillness. "Fine," Keegan replied automatically, though his mind was racing. What was his father doing in Bitterroot? How had he found him? And what could he possibly want after all these years? Climbing down from the ladder, Keegan instructed his crew to continue with the roofing and walked toward the general store, his heart hammering against his ribs. Before he reached it, however, Tobias emerged, glancing around the street with the wary vigilance of a man accustomed to hostile territory. Their eyes met, and for a moment neither moved. Then Tobias's weathered face split into a grin that didn't reach his cold eyes. "Well, if it ain't my boy," he called, his voice carrying down the street. "All grown up and looking prosperous." Keegan approached cautiously, painfully aware of the curious glances from townspeople within earshot. "Father," he acknowledged stiffly. "What brings you to Bitterroot?" "Can a man visit his only son?" Tobias countered, spreading his hands in a gesture of innocence that Keegan knew from experience was anything but. "Heard from that uncle of yours that you'd settled here. Thought I'd see for myself what could possibly have stopped my restless boy in his tracks." The reference to his uncle's letters confirmed what Keegan had suspected. His father had been monitoring his whereabouts from a distance. The knowledge unsettled him deeply. "I'm working," Keegan said curtly, building the new schoolhouse. If you'll excuse me. A builder now, are you? Tobias interrupted, his tone mocking. Last I heard you were pushing cattle up from Texas, made quite a name for yourself, according to some. One of the best trail hands in the business. Things change, Keegan replied evenly, though tension coiled in his gut. Indeed they do, his father agreed, his gaze drifting past Keegan to where Abigail had emerged from the church, her arms full of wildflowers for wedding decorations. And I believe I'm beginning to understand why. His smile widened, turning predatory. Aren't you going to introduce me to the pretty lady who's tamed my wild son? Before Keegan could respond, Abigail had approached, curiosity and warmth in her expression. Keegan, is this someone you know? Keegan's jaw tightened. Abigail, this is Tobias McCoy, my father. The words tasted bitter in his mouth. Father, this is Miss Abigail Gardner. My fiancée. Surprise flickered across Tobias's face, followed quickly by calculation. Fiancé, is it? Well, now that is news. He removed his hat with exaggerated courtesy. A pleasure, Miss Gardner. I can see why my boy has decided to put down roots. You're a vision. Abigail smiled politely, though Keegan could sense her confusion at the tension between them. It's lovely to meet you, Mr. McCoy. What a wonderful surprise before the wedding. Will you be staying in town long? Wouldn't miss my only son's wedding for the world, Tobias declared, shooting Keegan a challenging look. Though I'm hurt I had to hear about it secondhand. No invitation for your old father, Keegan. The accusation hung in the air, laden with years of unresolved conflict. Keegan felt trapped, unable to explain to Abigail in this public setting why he'd never even considered informing his father of their engagement, yet equally unable to reject him outright without appearing unforgivably cold. We sent announcements only to those whose whereabouts we knew, he said finally, the diplomatic response feeling inadequate. I hadn't heard from you in 8 years. Tobias clapped a hand to his chest in mock distress. My fault entirely. The life of a prospector keeps a man moving. His gaze sharpened. But I'm here now, ready to make amends. Better late than never, isn't that what they say? Abigail, sensing the undercurrents but not understanding their source, stepped into the awkward silence. You must join us for dinner this evening, Mr. McCoy. We're dining with Reverend and Mrs. Palmer at 6. I'm sure they would be delighted to include you. That's mighty generous of you, Miss Gardner, Tobias said, his voice smooth as creek stones. I accept with pleasure. Keegan wanted to object, but couldn't find the words without revealing the depth of his estrangement from his father, something he hadn't fully explained even to Abigail. They'd spoken of his childhood, of his mother's death and his early years on the frontier, but he'd always glossed over the painful final confrontation with Tobias and their years of separation. Wonderful, Abigail said, clearly pleased by what she perceived as a family reunion. If you'll excuse me, I need to finish these arrangements for the church. Keegan, perhaps you could help your father find accommodation. Before Keegan could respond, Tobias waved away the suggestion. No need to trouble yourself, son. My associates and I have already secured rooms at the hotel. He nodded toward the saloon where the other riders had disappeared. Just some business partners passing through on our way to more promising territory. The explanation raised more questions than it answered, but Abigail was already moving away, her arms full of flowers, leaving Keegan alone with the father he'd hoped never to see again. Business partners? Keegan asked skeptically once Abigail was out of earshot. What kind of business exactly? Tobias's affable expression hardened. The kind that doesn't concern you, boy. Unless you're offering to contribute to the enterprise. His eyes traveled over Keegan's now respectable clothes and the partially built schoolhouse behind him. Though it seems you found a more comfortable line of work. A builder and a husband-to-be, who would have thought it? What do you want? Keegan demanded, cutting through the pretense. Why are you really here? For a moment Tobias's mask slipped, revealing the bitter, grasping man Keegan remembered from his youth. Maybe I just wanted to see what became of my son. Maybe I'm getting older and thinking about family ties. His eyes narrowed. Or maybe I heard about a certain schoolteacher's family connections back east. Gardner isn't that common a name, and Boston society has a rather prominent member by that surname, a banker with considerable holdings. Cold dread settled in Keegan's stomach. You've been asking questions about Abigail,
Just making conversation in the saloon, Tobias said innocently. Amazing what people will share over a friendly drink. Seems your intended comes from money, son, real money. The kind that might look favorably on investment opportunities out west, especially if presented by family. The implication was clear, and it turned Keegan's dread to fury. Stay away from Abigail, he warned, his voice low but intense. Whatever scheme you're running, whatever angle you're playing, leave her out of it. Tobias raised his eyebrows. Is that any way to talk to your father? After our touching reunion, he shook his head in mock disappointment. I expected more gratitude, considering I could have shared some colorful stories about your past with your new friends here in Bitterroot. Stories that might make them question whether you're really suited to be their respected schoolteacher's husband. The threat hung between them, poisonous with possibility. Keegan had never shared the full truth of his family history with anyone in Bitterroot, not even Abigail. They knew he was a former cowhand with carpentry skills, a man of few words but reliable character. They didn't know about the years immediately following his mother's death, when a grief-stricken and increasingly desperate Tobias had dragged his young son through a series of increasingly dubious enterprises, some of which had skirted the edges of legality. Keegan had extricated himself as soon as he was old enough to strike out on his own, but the memories remained, along with the fear that his father's shadow might someday reach into the life he'd built for himself. That shadow had now arrived in Bitterroot 1 week before his wedding. 6 o'clock at the Palmers, Tobias reminded him, settling his hat back on his head. Looking forward to getting better acquainted with my future daughter-in-law. She seems like a real genteel lady. The emphasis on genteel carried its own warning. Wouldn't want anything to spoil her happiness, would we? With a tip of his hat, Tobias sauntered toward the saloon, leaving Keegan standing in the street, his mind racing with equal parts anger and apprehension. The father he'd thought safely in his past had reappeared at the worst possible moment, threatening everything Keegan had built in Bitterroot, most especially his relationship with Abigail. The question now was whether to fight or acquiesce to whatever his father was planning, and more urgently, whether to tell Abigail the truth about his past before Tobias could twist it into something unrecognizable. With a sense of foreboding, Keegan turned back toward the schoolhouse. For now, he had work to finish. But tonight, at dinner, the real battle would begin. Dinner at the Palmers proved to be an exercise in tension disguised as civility. Tobias was at his most charming, regaling the Reverend and his wife with sanitized tales of Keegan's childhood, expressing paternal pride in his son's accomplishments, and flattering Abigail with seemingly genuine warmth. I can see why my boy was finally ready to settle down, he told her, his tone confiding. Beauty and brains, a rare combination, especially out here on the frontier. Abigail smiled politely, though Keegan could sense her growing awareness that something was amiss. She kept glancing between father and son, noting the contrast between Tobias's effusive manner and Keegan's tight-lipped responses. Keegan tells me you're a musician as well as a teacher, Tobias continued, expertly navigating the conversation away from any questions about his own long absence from his son's life. I'd love to hear you play sometime before the wedding. Music was my dear departed wife's passion as well. He affected a wistful expression. Rebecca could make that old piano of ours sing like nothing you've ever heard. It was the casual appropriation of his mother's memory that finally broke Keegan's strained silence. You sold that piano 6 months after she died, he said flatly, for money to buy into that mining claim in Colorado. An uncomfortable silence fell over the table. Mrs. Palmer looked distressed while the Reverend cleared his throat awkwardly. Tobias's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. Hard decisions had to be made after your mother's passing, he said smoothly. A widower with a young son to support can't afford sentimentality. He turned to the Palmers. You understand, I'm sure, how difficult those years were, trying to raise a boy alone, maintain a living, and navigate my own grief. I made mistakes, what father doesn't? The appeal worked its intended effect. Mrs. Palmer's expression softened with sympathy, while Reverend Palmer nodded in understanding. Parenting is perhaps the most challenging calling the Lord gives us, the minister agreed, and doing so while grieving must have been doubly difficult. Exactly, Tobias said, shooting Keegan a look of triumph so quick that only his son caught it. Which is why I'm so grateful for this chance to reconnect with Keegan now, to be present for this important moment in his life. Abigail, who had been watching the exchange closely, placed her hand over Keegan's on the table. "Family reunions can be complicated," she said diplomatically. "But I'm glad you're here, Mr. McCoy. Keegan has spoken of his mother often, but I've heard less about you. I look forward to getting to know my future father-in-law better." Her gentle squeeze of Keegan's hand conveyed silent support, even without fully understanding the situation. Keegan felt a rush of gratitude for her perception and loyalty, but it was mixed with dread. Sooner or later, Tobias would reveal the truth, or his version of it, and Abigail would learn things about Keegan's past that he had carefully avoided discussing. The remainder of the dinner passed without further incident, though Keegan remained tense, waiting for his father's next move. It came as they were preparing to leave, when Tobias casually mentioned his business associates waiting at the hotel. "Fine men, all of them," he assured Reverend Palmer. "Though perhaps a bit rough around the edges. We're involved in a mining venture north of here, very promising claims that just need the right investment to develop properly." "How interesting," the Reverend said politely. "What sort of minerals are you prospecting?" "Gold primarily, though there's silver potential as well," Tobias replied with well-practiced enthusiasm. "I'd be happy to share the details with anyone who might be interested in getting in on the ground floor of something truly exceptional. The returns could be substantial." Keegan recognized the pitch immediately. It was the same line his father had used dozens of times before, in saloons and boarding houses across the West, targeting anyone with savings to invest in claims that were either non-existent or worthless. Sometimes the schemes involved actual mining, other times they were pure fiction. Either way, the investors inevitably lost everything while Tobias and his partners disappeared with the money. "I'm sure Reverend Palmer isn't interested in speculation," Keegan cut in before the minister could respond. "And we should be going. It's getting late, and I have an early start tomorrow." Of course," Tobias agreed amiably. "Though I was hoping to speak with you privately before you escort your lovely fiancée home. Perhaps you could join me for a nightcap at the hotel afterward." It was a command disguised as an invitation, and Keegan knew refusal would only delay the inevitable confrontation. "Fine," he said shortly. "I'll meet you there." Abigail looked between them, clearly sensing the undercurrents but unable to address them in the Palmers' presence. "It's been a lovely evening," she said to their hosts. "Thank you for including Mr. McCoy on such short notice." As they walked through the quiet streets toward Abigail's cabin, the tension that had been building all evening finally found voice. "Are you going to tell me what's really happening between you and your father?" Abigail asked directly, "because it's obvious there's more to the story than a simple estrangement." Keegan sighed heavily. He'd known this moment would come, had been preparing for it since Tobias's arrival, but that didn't make it any easier. "It's complicated," he began. "Most family relationships are," Abigail replied. "But I need to know the truth, Keegan. Especially if it affects our future together." They'd reached her cabin, but instead of saying good night, Abigail opened the door and beckoned him inside. The small space was neat and cozy, lit by a single lamp that cast warm light over her modest furnishings. She gestured for him to sit at the table while she stoked the small stove to ward off the evening chill. "Start at the beginning," she said, settling into the chair across from him. "And don't leave anything out." Looking into her earnest face, Keegan found the courage to share the story he'd kept buried for years. He told her about the aftermath of his mother's death, how his father, consumed by grief and anger, had uprooted them from their modest but stable life in Missouri to chase increasingly desperate schemes across the Western Territories. At first he tried legitimate work, Keegan explained. Ranch hand, store clerk, whatever he could find, but the jobs never lasted. He'd quarrel with the boss or decide there was a quicker way to make money elsewhere. Abigail listened without interruption as Keegan described how, over time, Tobias's enterprises had grown increasingly dubious. Fake mining claims sold to unsuspecting investors, rigged card games that fleeced newcomers to frontier towns. Once, a stage robbery that Tobias had insisted was justified because the mining company it carried payroll for had cheated him years earlier. "I was 14 when he tried to involve me in that one," Keegan said, the memory still bitter after all these years. "He wanted me to scout the stage's approach while he and his partners waited in ambush."
I refused. What happened? Abigail asked softly. He beat me for disobedience, then locked me in our room at the boarding house while they did the job anyway. Keegan's hands clenched on the table. A guard was shot. He survived, but it could have been murder. Oh, Keegan. Abigail reached across to cover his hands with hers. After that, things got worse, Keegan continued. I tried to distance myself, took odd jobs where I could find them, stayed away from the boarding houses and camps where he'd hold court with his latest partners. But I was still just a kid, still dependent on him in many ways. The final confrontation had come when Keegan was 16. Tobias had been planning another confidence scheme, this time targeting a widow who had recently inherited a substantial sum from her late husband's insurance. He wanted me to befriend her son, gain the family's trust, Keegan explained. I refused again, told him I was done being part of his schemes, done watching him cheat and steal from people who couldn't afford to lose what little they had. His voice roughened with the memory. We fought, physically fought. He was drunk and I was nearly grown by then, strong from ranch work. I managed to get away, took what few possessions I could carry, and left that night. You haven't seen him since? Abigail asked. Keegan shook his head. Not until today. I avoided anywhere I thought he might be operating, changed my route if I heard rumors he'd been seen in an area. I didn't want anything to do with him or his world. And now he's here, Abigail said thoughtfully. 1 week before our wedding, with business associates and talk of mining investments. It's not a coincidence, Keegan confirmed grimly. He mentioned your family, Abigail. Specifically, your father's banking connections in Boston. Abigail's eyes widened. He's looking for investors. For a scheme that will leave them with nothing but worthless paper, Keegan said. And he's using our wedding, our connection to respectable people like the Palmers, to establish credibility. That's why he accepted my dinner invitation so readily, Abigail realized. He's targeting the Palmers. Them and anyone else in town with savings or Eastern connections, Keegan confirmed. And if I try to expose him, he'll reveal your past involvement in his activities, Abigail finished. Even though you were a child, even though you refused to participate in the worst of it. Keegan looked down at their joined hands. People will believe what they want to believe, Abigail, especially about a drifter who arrived less than a year ago and is suddenly building their schoolhouse and marrying their teacher. The implication hung between them, that Tobias's revelations could damage not only Keegan's standing in the community, but potentially Abigail's as well. A schoolteacher was held to the highest moral standards. An association with someone from a questionable background could raise uncomfortable questions among the more conservative elements in town. I've never lied to you about who I am, Keegan said quietly, but I've never told the full truth either. I was ashamed of where I came from, afraid it would color how you saw me. Abigail was silent for a long moment, her expression thoughtful. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady. Do you know what first attracted me to you, Keegan, before we'd even exchanged a word? He shook his head, uncertain where she was going with the question. It was the way you listened to my music, she said simply. Not just hearing it, but truly listening with your whole being. That requires a kind of openness, a capacity for beauty and feeling that doesn't exist in people who are fundamentally dishonest or cruel. She squeezed his hands. I've seen your character in 100 small ways since then, in how you treat others, how you approach your work, how you've embraced this community despite your instinct for solitude. Those things tell me far more about who you are than your father's sins or the difficult childhood you endured because of them. Relief washed through Keegan, so profound it left him momentarily speechless. He'd been braced for disappointment, for reassessment, perhaps even for rejection. Instead, Abigail was offering unconditional acceptance, not because she dismissed the significance of his past, but because she saw beyond it to the man he had become. I don't deserve you, he said finally, his voice thick with emotion. Nonsense, Abigail replied firmly. We deserve each other precisely because we've both chosen to be more than our circumstances might have dictated. I refuse to become a decorative Boston society wife, and you refuse to follow your father's corrupt path. She released his hands and stood, moving around the table to stand before him. The question now is what we do about Tobias and his business associates, because I won't have him threatening our future or harming this community. Keegan rose as well, drawing her into his arms. I need to meet with him tonight, he said. Find out exactly what he wants, what it would take for him to leave Bitterroot and never return. Money, Abigail guessed. Isn't that usually what men like him want? Usually, Keegan agreed, but with my father there's often more to it. He enjoys the game itself, the manipulation, the sense of power over others. He sighed. And in this case, I think there's a personal element as well. He sees my settled life here as some kind of rejection of him and his ways. Which it is, Abigail pointed out pragmatically. Yes, but having it demonstrated so clearly might push him toward more destructive actions, not less. Keegan kissed her forehead gently. Let me handle this, Abigail. I know how he operates. I can manage him. She pulled back slightly to look up at him, her expression determined. We'll handle it together, she corrected. I won't have you facing this alone, Keegan. Whatever he says, whatever he threatens, we'll confront it as partners. Though part of him wanted to protect her from his father's toxic influence, Keegan recognized the wisdom in her words. They were building a life together, which meant sharing burdens as well as joys. And Abigail was no delicate flower to be sheltered from harsh realities. She was a woman who had made her own choices, defied convention, and carved out a place for herself on the frontier. Together, then, he agreed, but not tonight. Let me at least discover what he's after, establish the parameters of the threat. Then we can develop a strategy. Abigail considered this, then nodded reluctantly. Very well. But promise me you won't agree to anything without consulting me first. I promise, Keegan said solemnly. As he walked toward the hotel where Tobias was staying, Keegan felt a curious lightness despite the confrontation ahead. The weight of his secret past had been lifted, and Abigail's acceptance had reinforced his belief that the life they were building together could withstand whatever challenges arose, even those that emerged from the shadows of his troubled childhood. Now he just had to convince his father that threatening that future was a battle not worth fighting. The Silver Spur Hotel was actually little more than a two-story boarding house with pretensions, its name a grandiose attempt to attract visitors who might otherwise pass through Bitterroot without stopping. At this hour, the small lobby was deserted except for a dozing clerk behind the front desk, who barely stirred as Keegan entered. The adjoining saloon, however, was still doing brisk business. Through the connecting door, Keegan could see his father seated at a corner table with 3 other men, the business associates who had ridden into town with him. They were engaged in what appeared to be an intense discussion, heads bent close together over glasses of whiskey. Keegan recognized the type immediately. Frontier opportunists, men who drifted from scheme to scheme, always one step ahead of the law or angry marks. They had hard eyes and practiced smiles, and they carried their weapons with the casual comfort of men accustomed to using them. Taking a deep breath, Keegan pushed through the saloon doors and approached the table. Conversation ceased abruptly as the men noticed his arrival, their expressions shifting from open discussion to guarded assessment. Gentlemen, Keegan nodded curtly before focusing on his father. You wanted to speak with me. Tobias smiled broadly, though his eyes remained calculating. My boy. Join us for a drink, he gestured expansively to an empty chair. Let me introduce you to my associates. This is Delaney, Carter, and Wilson, all experienced mining men with an eye for opportunity. The 3 nodded with varying degrees of enthusiasm. Delaney, a lean man with a scar bisecting one eyebrow, openly assessed Keegan with the wariness of a coyote encountering a potential threat. Carter, heavyset with a prospector's beard, offered a perfunctory greeting before returning to his whiskey. Wilson, the youngest of the 3, smiled with artificial warmth that didn't reach his cold eyes. Not interested in your associates, Keegan said bluntly, remaining standing, or your mining schemes. Let's talk privately. Tobias's smile tightened, but he nodded to the others. Give me a few minutes with my son, boys, family matters to discuss. The 3 men exchanged glances before gathering their drinks and moving to another table, though not so far that they couldn't keep an eye on the conversation. Keegan took the vacated seat, declining Tobias's offer of whiskey with a shake of his head. So, Tobias began, swirling the amber liquid in his own glass. You've done well for yourself. Builder, respected community member, engaged to a beautiful, and if rumors are correct, well-connected young lady. His tone suggested this was an unexpected and somewhat suspicious development. Quite a change from the sullen boy,
who rode away from our camp 8 years ago. What do you want? Keegan asked directly, unwilling to engage in his father's circuitous approach. Why are you really in Bitterroot? Tobias's affable mask slipped slightly, revealing a flash of the bitterness beneath. Can a father take pride in his son's accomplishments, want to share in his happiness? We both know that's not why you're here, Keegan replied evenly. You've never done anything without an angle, a way to benefit yourself. So I'll ask again, what do you want? For a moment, father and son stared at each other across the scarred table, the years of estrangement and mutual disappointment hanging between them like an invisible barrier. Then Tobias sighed, dropping the pretense. Fine, no sentiment, straight to business. You always were a practical boy. He leaned forward, lowering his voice. I need $5,000 to secure mining rights in Montana Territory. Real rights this time, for a claim that's already showing promising yields. The sum was substantial, more than most frontier families saw in years. It was also, Keegan knew with certainty, intended for something other than legitimate mining rights. And if I refuse, he asked, though he already knew the answer. Tobias's expression hardened. Then I'd be forced to share certain colorful stories about our past enterprises with your new friends here in Bitterroot. Particularly with Reverend Palmer, who seems to have such high opinion of your character. He paused meaningfully. And with your fiancé's family back east, I imagine the Gardners would be quite interested to learn what kind of man their daughter is marrying. It was the threat Keegan had expected, yet hearing it stated so baldly still sent a surge of anger through him. Abigail already knows everything, he said, taking satisfaction in his father's momentary surprise. I told her tonight about your schemes, about the stage robbery, about all of it. She knows exactly who I am and where I came from. Tobias recovered quickly, his expression shifting to grudging respect. Smart move, getting ahead of the story, but what about the rest of the town? The people who will be sending their precious children to the school you're building, taught by the woman who's foolish enough to marry into our family. He shook his head. Small towns run on reputation, son. Once it's damaged, it's nearly impossible to repair. So you're blackmailing me, Keegan said flatly. Threatening to destroy my standing here unless I give you money I don't have, for a scheme that probably doesn't exist. Blackmail's such an ugly word, Tobias protested. I prefer to think of it as a family investment, and as for not having the money, his gaze grew shrewd. You've been working steady for months, building a schoolhouse must pay well. And I'd wager you've been saving for years, living lean on the trail, putting aside every penny toward that solitary cabin you always talked about. When Keegan didn't deny it, Tobias smiled. Thought so. You always were cautious with your coin, even as a boy. It was true. Keegan had accumulated a substantial sum over his years of drifting, enough to purchase a small parcel of land and modest supplies to start a ranch, which had been his plan before Abigail. That money was now earmarked for their future together, a proper home in Bitterroot, perhaps eventually a ranch of their own on the outskirts of town where they could raise a family while maintaining their ties to the community. I won't give you my savings, Keegan said firmly. Not for blackmail, not for some fictitious mining claim, not for anything. Tobias's expression darkened. You're making a mistake, boy. I'm offering you a simple transaction, money for silence. It's more than fair, considering the damage I could do. Do your worst, Keegan replied, rising from his chair. Tell whatever stories you want. This town knows me by my actions over the past months, not by your twisted version of my childhood. They'll believe what they choose to believe. It was a gamble, one that might cost him dearly if the more conservative elements in Bitterroot decided that his father's revelations made him unsuitable as a husband for their schoolteacher, or as the builder of their children's place of education. But it was a risk Keegan was willing to take rather than submit to Tobias's manipulation. And what about your pretty fiancé's family? Tobias called as Keegan turned to leave. Think they'll be so understanding when they learn their daughter is marrying the son of a notorious frontier grifter, a boy who grew up surrounded by con men and criminals. Keegan paused, then turned back slowly. Abigail makes her own choices, he said quietly. As do I. That's something you've never understood, father. Not everyone can be manipulated or controlled through fear. Some of us choose a different path. For the first time, Tobias seemed genuinely unsettled by his son's resistance. You've changed, he said, almost accusingly. The boy I knew would have calculated the odds, made the pragmatic choice. I'm not a boy anymore, Keegan replied simply. And I finally have something worth fighting for. With that, he walked away, leaving his father staring after him with an expression that mingled frustration, calculation, and something that might almost have been a grudging respect. Outside, the night air was cool against Keegan's flushed face. Stars scattered across the vast Wyoming sky, their familiar constellations reminding him of countless nights spent on the open range, beneath the same endless canopy. The simplicity of those times, when his only responsibilities had been to the herd and to his fellow drovers, seemed almost quaint compared to the complex web of relationships and obligations he now navigated. Yet he wouldn't trade his current life for that solitary existence, not for anything. The connections he'd formed in Bitterroot, with Abigail foremost, but also with the community that had gradually accepted him, gave his days a meaning and purpose that had been lacking during his years of drifting. As he walked toward his rented room, Keegan considered his options. His father wouldn't give up easily, that wasn't in Tobias McCoy's nature. The next move might be more direct, more damaging than mere threats. And it wouldn't just target Keegan, Abigail, the Palmers, perhaps even other residents of Bitterroot might find themselves caught in Tobias's schemes. The obvious solution would be to give his father what he wanted, the money to make him go away. But Keegan knew from bitter experience that such capitulation would only invite further demands. Tobias would be back whenever funds ran low or a scheme failed, his hand perpetually extended, his threats increasingly bold. No, the only way to deal with his father was to stand firm, to make it clear that Bitterroot was not fertile ground for his particular brand of deception. And to do that, Keegan needed allies, people who understood the situation and could help protect the community from Tobias and his business associates. With newfound determination, Keegan changed direction, heading toward Jensen's store. The owner was also the mayor and the most influential man in Bitterroot. If anyone could rally the town against potential swindlers, it was Sam Jensen. The next morning dawned clear and crisp, the late spring air filled with the scent of wildflowers and the promise of approaching summer. Keegan had slept little, his mind churning with concerns about his father's next move and plans for countering it. His conversation with Jensen the previous night had been productive. The storekeeper had immediately grasped the threat posed by Tobias and his associates, and had agreed to quietly warn key community members about potential investment schemes. "We've had grifters through here before," Jensen had assured him. "Most folks in Bitterroot are too practical to fall for fancy tales of easy riches, and those who might be tempted will listen to a word of caution from me or the Reverend." It was reassuring, but Keegan knew his father well enough to anticipate that he wouldn't limit himself to straightforward confidence schemes. If his primary approach failed, Tobias would find another angle, another vulnerability to exploit. That concern was validated when Keegan arrived at the schoolhouse construction site to find one of his workers waiting with a troubled expression. "Boss, there's been some developments," the man said hesitantly. "That lumber we've been expecting from Cheyenne, Carter over at the freight office says there's been a problem with payment, claims our credit's no good." Keegan frowned. "That's impossible. Jensen guaranteed the payment himself as head of the town council." The worker shifted uncomfortably. "That's what I told him, but Carter says he got a telegram yesterday afternoon saying to hold all deliveries until cash payment is received. Something about concerns over the financial stability of the project." It was such an obvious ploy that Keegan almost laughed. His father must have friends at the freight company in Cheyenne, or more likely, had bribed someone to send a false telegram. It was exactly the kind of disruptive tactic Tobias favored, creating problems that only he could solve for a price. "Tell the rest of the crew to focus on finishing the roof with what we have," Keegan instructed. "I'll sort out the lumber situation." As the worker nodded and moved away, Keegan spotted Abigail approaching from the direction of the church, her expression bright despite the early hour. Seeing her momentarily pushed aside his concerns about his father's machinations. "Good morning," she called, her smile warming him more effectively than the spring sunshine. "I thought you might appreciate some coffee." She held up a small pot and 2 tin cups. "Mrs. Palmer sent biscuits as well." "You're a vision," Keegan said sincerely, taking the pot and cups from her. "Though I'm not sure I deserve such service." It's entirely selfish on my part, Abigail assured him with mock seriousness. I need this schoolhouse finished before September, and I've learned that well-fed carpenters work faster. They settled on a stack of lumber at the edge of the construction site, the half-built schoolhouse rising behind them like a promise of the future. As they shared the simple breakfast, Keegan updated Abigail on his conversation with his father the previous night and the apparent attempt to delay construction materials. "He's testing your resolve," Abigail observed shrewdly. "Seeing how you'll respond to pressure." Keegan nodded, and showing that he can create problems beyond simple threats to reveal my past. The lumber delay is just the beginning. If I don't give in, he'll escalate. Then we need to send a clear message that neither of us will be intimidated, Abigail said firmly. Starting with resolving this delivery issue immediately, she thought for a moment. The station master in Cheyenne is a friend of Reverend Palmer's. A telegram from the Reverend might clarify that any instructions to withhold deliveries are unauthorized. It's worth trying, Keegan agreed. Though my father rarely limits himself to a single approach, he'll have other schemes in motion. What about a more direct confrontation, Abigail suggested, not just you alone but with community support. If Tobias sees that the entire town stands with us, he might recognize that his usual tactics won't work here. It was a logical suggestion, but Keegan hesitated. Confronting my father publicly means explaining our history, our connection. Are you prepared for what that might mean, the questions it could raise about my background? Abigail's gaze was steady. I meant what I said last night, Keegan. I'm not ashamed of you or your past. This town has accepted you based on who you are now, not where you came from. If a few people change their minds because of your father's revelations, then their good opinion wasn't worth having in the first place. Her confidence bolstered his own, but a lingering doubt remained. And your family in Boston, your father's reputation at the bank, my background could reflect poorly on them if it becomes widely known. My family sent me west because they recognized I needed to make my own choices, live my own life, Abigail replied. They may not fully understand my decisions, but they respect them. And as for my father's reputation, he's weathered far worse than his daughter marrying a man with a complicated past. Keegan wanted to believe her, to trust that their love and the life they were building together could withstand whatever storm his father brought. But years of caution, of protecting himself from emotional and physical harm, made complete faith difficult. Let's try the telegram first, he said finally, and I'll speak with Jensen again about warning the town more broadly about potential schemes. If that doesn't deter my father, then we can consider a more direct approach. Abigail nodded, accepting his caution while clearly remaining ready for a more confrontational strategy if needed. It was one of the things he loved most about her, that balance of pragmatism and courage, her willingness to fight for what mattered without rushing headlong into unnecessary conflict. As they finished their coffee, a shadow fell across them. Looking up, Keegan found himself facing Tobias, who had approached silently while they were deep in conversation. His father's expression was carefully neutral, though a hint of calculation showed in his eyes as they flicked between Keegan and Abigail. "Good morning," Tobias said pleasantly. "Hope I'm not interrupting an important discussion." The emphasis on important suggested he knew exactly what they'd been talking about. "Father," Keegan acknowledged coolly, rising to place himself slightly between Tobias and Abigail. "What brings you to the construction site?" "Just taking an interest in my son's work," Tobias replied innocently. "Impressive progress, considering the difficulty of getting quality materials out here on the frontier." His meaningful glance toward the lumber pile indicated he knew precisely about the delayed shipment. Abigail stood as well, her manner composed but alert. "It's nice of you to take an interest, Mr. McCoy. We're quite proud of what Keegan has accomplished with the schoolhouse." "The entire town has been supportive of the project." "The entire town, you say?" Tobias raised his eyebrows. "How unusual. In my experience, frontier communities rarely agree on anything, especially how to spend their limited resources." He glanced around the construction site with exaggerated interest. "Must have taken quite a bit of persuasion to get them to fund such an ambitious building." "Education is valued here," Abigail said simply, "as is honest work." The emphasis on honest was subtle but unmistakable. Tobias's smile tightened fractionally, but he maintained his affable demeanor. "Indeed,
Honesty is so important, don't you agree, son? Being truthful about one's past, one's experiences. I've hidden nothing that matters, Keegan replied evenly. Abigail knows everything about my upbringing, and the town judges me by my actions here, not by ancient history. Ancient history, Tobias chuckled. 8 years isn't so very long ago, and some of our mutual acquaintances have rather long memories. He turned to Abigail with an air of false confession. My boy was quite the quick study in his youth. Had a talent for certain enterprises that would have taken him far if he hadn't developed such inconvenient principles. Abigail met his gaze steadily. I believe those principles are exactly what make Keegan the man he is today, the man I'm proud to be marrying. We all make choices, Mr. McCoy. Some choose paths that harm others for personal gain. Some choose a different way. The pointed remark hit its target. Tobias's genial mask slipped for a moment, revealing a flash of the bitterness and resentment that had driven him for years. Pretty words from a sheltered Eastern girl who's never had to fight for survival in this wilderness, he said coldly. Judge me if you like, but you've never faced the choices I had to make after my wife died. No one denies you faced hardship, Keegan interjected, unwilling to let his father shift blame or manipulate Abigail's compassion. But you chose how to respond to it. You chose deception and theft over honest work, even when it meant involving your own son in your schemes. Workers had begun to gather nearby, their curiosity piqued by the tense conversation. Keegan was acutely aware of their presence, of the risk that his father might say something that couldn't be unsaid, that would permanently damage his standing in the community. Yet he stood his ground, refusing to be intimidated. Tobias seemed to sense the shifting dynamic as well. His gaze swept over the small audience before returning to Keegan with narrowed calculation. We should continue this discussion privately, he suggested. Family matters, after all. There's nothing to discuss, Keegan said firmly. I told you last night my decision is final. I won't be giving you money now or ever. And if you try to harm my reputation or Abigail's with tales from the past, you'll find this town less receptive than you imagine. For a long moment, father and son stared at each other, the years of conflict and disappointment hanging between them like a physical presence. Then Tobias smiled, not the practiced, charming smile he used to win confidence, but something harder and more genuine. You've grown a backbone, he observed, something like pride mingling with frustration in his tone. Time was you'd have calculated the cost and paid whatever was necessary to avoid trouble. I learned that some things are worth fighting for, Keegan replied. And some costs are too high, no matter what seems expedient in the moment. Tobias glanced at Abigail, his expression speculative. She's changed you, he said, the observation neither compliment nor criticism, merely acknowledgement. Interesting, he adjusted his hat, a gesture that signaled the conversation was ending on his terms. We'll speak again, son. I'm not finished in Bitterroot quite yet. With a nod to Abigail that might have been respectful or mocking, it was impossible to tell with Tobias. He turned and walked away, his posture relaxed but purposeful, a man confident in his ability to navigate any situation to his advantage. As he disappeared down the street, Keegan let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Abigail's hand found his, her fingers intertwining with his in silent support. He won't give up easily, she observed quietly. No, Keegan agreed, he never does. He glanced at the workers who were still watching curiously and raised his voice slightly. Back to work, everyone, that roof won't finish itself. As the men dispersed, Abigail squeezed his hand. Neither will we, Keegan. Whatever your father has planned, we'll face it together, and we'll win. Looking into her determined eyes, Keegan found himself believing her. For the first time in his life, he wasn't facing adversity alone. With Abigail by his side, and the support of the community they were building together, perhaps they could indeed withstand whatever storm Tobias McCoy was preparing to unleash. The next 3 days passed in a strange, tense holding pattern. Tobias and his associates were frequently seen in town, drinking at the saloon, engaging in seemingly casual conversations with locals, occasionally making trips to neighboring settlements and returning with additional supplies or correspondence. But no overt moves were made against Keegan or Abigail, no public revelations about his past, no further interference with the schoolhouse construction.
The lumber delivery issue had been resolved quickly through Reverend Palmer's intervention, just as Abigail had suggested. A telegram from the Reverend to his friend in Cheyenne had clarified that any instructions to withhold shipments were fraudulent, and the materials had arrived the following day. Work on the schoolhouse had resumed at full pace, with the roof now complete and interior finishing underway. Wedding preparations continued as well, with the ceremony just 4 days away. Despite Keegan's concerns about his father's potential disruption, Abigail had insisted they proceed as planned, refusing to give Tobias the satisfaction of delaying their happiness. Besides, she had pointed out pragmatically, once we're married, any revelations about your past will have less impact. The deed will be done, so to speak. Keegan had to admit the logic of her position, even as he worried about the strain the situation was placing on her. Yet Abigail seemed to thrive under pressure, dividing her time between teaching her final classes of the term, overseeing wedding arrangements, and coordinating with Jensen and Reverend Palmer on strategies to protect the town from Tobias's schemes. It was Abigail who first noticed the subtle shift in the town's atmosphere on the 4th day of Tobias's presence in Bitterroot. She mentioned it to Keegan as they walked together after Sunday services, the spring sunshine warm on their shoulders. "Something's changed," she said, her voice low to avoid being overheard by other churchgoers dispersing around them. "People are watching us differently today, have you noticed?" Keegan had been so focused on the schoolhouse and on watching for direct moves from his father that he hadn't paid attention to the broader community dynamics. But now that Abigail mentioned it, he recalled several odd moments during the service, sidelong glances, whispered conversations that ceased when he looked in their direction, a certain coolness from people who had previously been friendly. "You think he's started talking," Keegan surmised, his stomach tightening, "spreading stories about my past?" "Not openly," Abigail replied thoughtfully. "That would be too direct, too easily countered. I think it's more subtle, hints and insinuations, just enough to raise questions without making specific accusations that could be addressed." It was exactly his father's style, creating a climate of doubt and suspicion rather than making claims that might be refuted. The technique was particularly effective in small communities like Bitterroot, where reputation and trust were currency more valuable than gold. "We should talk to Jensen," Keegan decided. "See what he's hearing." But before they could change direction toward the general store, they were intercepted by Mrs. Hargrove, the same woman who had previously suggested Abigail consider her nephew as a more suitable match. The older woman's pinched expression suggested this conversation would be no more pleasant than their previous encounters. "Miss Gardner," Mrs. Hargrove began, deliberately ignoring Keegan, "I wonder if I might have a word with you." Privately, the emphasis made her dismissal of Keegan's presence unmistakable. Abigail's grip on Keegan's arm tightened slightly. "Anything you wish to say to me can be said in front of my fiancée, Mrs. Hargrove," she replied politely but firmly. "We have no secrets from each other." The older woman's lips pursed in disapproval. "Very well, though I had hoped to spare you embarrassment." She glanced around to ensure they wouldn't be overheard, then continued in a lower voice. "It has come to my attention that there may be concerns about Mr. McCoy's background and associations. Concerns that, as a friend of your family and a member of the school committee, I feel obligated to bring to your attention before it's too late." "Too late," Abigail echoed, her tone deliberately innocent. "Before the wedding, Mrs. Hargrove clarified, as if speaking to a particularly slow child. "There is still time to reconsider a decision made perhaps in haste, without full knowledge of the gentleman's history." Keegan felt Abigail's posture straighten beside him, her chin lifting in the subtle way it did when she was particularly determined. It was an expression he'd come to recognize and admire, the schoolteacher facing down a challenge with quiet, immovable dignity. "I assure you, Mrs. Hargrove, I am fully aware of Keegan's history," Abigail said calmly. "Every aspect of it, and I am proceeding with our wedding with complete confidence in his character and in our future together." "Mrs. Hargrove looked taken aback, clearly having expected denial or at least concern from the young teacher. "But surely you must be concerned about the impact on your position," she pressed. "The school committee has certain expectations regarding the moral character of those who teach our children, and by extension, their spouses." Are you suggesting the committee would reconsider my employment because of whom I choose to marry? Abigail asked directly. The blunt question seemed to fluster Mrs. Hargrove. Not precisely, she hedged. But there is talk, Miss Gardner, troubling talk about Mr. McCoy's past associations, about activities that might not bear close examination. A teacher must be above reproach, as I'm sure you understand. I understand perfectly, Abigail replied, her voice steady. I understand that you've been listening to gossip and innuendo from someone who has his own reasons for wanting to create discord. What I don't understand is why a woman of your standing in the community would participate in spreading unsubstantiated rumors rather than coming directly to the source with any concerns. Mrs. Hargrove drew herself up indignantly. I am merely conveying what others have observed. Mr. McCoy's own father has expressed concern about certain aspects of his son's past. Surely a father would know. My father, Keegan interrupted, unable to remain silent any longer, is not a reliable source of information about me or anything else. He abandoned any right to comment on my character or choices when he tried to involve me in criminal activities as a child, activities I refused to participate in, despite his pressure and his anger. The directness of his response seemed to startle Mrs. Hargrove into momentary silence. Keegan continued, his voice level but intense. I've never hidden the fact that I grew up in difficult circumstances, that my father chose paths I couldn't follow. What matters is the choice I made, to leave that life behind, to build something honest and meaningful. The people of Bitterroot have seen me work every day for months, have trusted me to build their schoolhouse, to become part of this community. He gestured toward the church behind them. In there just now, Reverend Palmer spoke about judging people by their fruits, not by rumors or past mistakes. I would hope that principle might apply to me as well. For a moment, Mrs. Hargrove seemed at a loss for words, her certainty visibly wavering in the face of Keegan's calm dignity and Abigail's unwavering support. But pride and stubbornness quickly reasserted themselves. Well, she said stiffly, I have done my duty in bringing these concerns to Miss Gardner's attention. What she chooses to do with the information is, of course, her decision. She nodded curtly. Good day to you both. As she marched away, her back rigid with disapproval, Abigail let out a long breath. That, she observed dryly, was merely the first skirmish in what promises to be a fascinating battle for the heart of Bitterroot's public opinion. Despite the seriousness of the situation, Keegan couldn't help but smile at her characterization. You're not worried? About Mrs. Hargrove? Hardly. Abigail's expression grew more thoughtful. But your father is clearly making moves behind the scenes. We need to understand what he's telling people and why. This isn't just about getting money from you anymore. He seems intent on undermining your position here, perhaps even destroying it completely. Revenge, Keegan said simply. For rejecting his way of life, for building something he couldn't. He shook his head, trying to make sense of his father's motivations. It's not rational, but then, Tobias has never been fully rational when it comes to family. My mother's death broke something in him that never healed. Abigail considered this, her expression compassionate but pragmatic. Understanding his pain doesn't excuse his actions. And it certainly doesn't mean we should allow him to hurt you or this town further. She took Keegan's arm again, steering them toward the general store. Come on, Jensen will have heard more than Mrs. Hargrove. We need to know exactly what we're facing. Sam Jensen was indeed better informed than the disapproving Mrs. Hargrove. As the owner of the general store and the unofficial center of Bitterroot's communication network, little happened in town without his knowledge. When Keegan and Abigail entered his store, he beckoned them toward the back room where he kept his accounts and conducted private business. Been expecting you too, he said grimly, closing the door behind them. Your father's been busy, McCoy. Keegan nodded unsurprised. What exactly is he saying, and to whom? Started subtle, Jensen replied, settling behind his cluttered desk. Casual mentions at the saloon about your colorful past, hints about youthful indiscretions that might concern a respectable community. Nothing specific enough to challenge directly. He stroked his neat beard thoughtfully. But in the last day or so, he's gotten more direct with certain influential people. Approached Hargrove yesterday with a story about you being involved in confidence schemes across 3 territories.
Suggested to Peterson that you might have been connected to a stage robbery in Colorado years back. Keegan's jaw tightened. The robbery he committed that I refused to help with. That's not the version he's sharing, Jensen said dryly. According to him, you were his lookout, warned the gang when the stage was approaching. That's a lie, Keegan said flatly. I was locked in a room at the boarding house because I refused to participate. Jensen held up a placating hand. I believe you, son, known you long enough to judge your character for myself, but others haven't had that advantage. And a father's word carries weight, even one as questionable as Tobias McCoy. Has he approached you directly, Abigail asked shrewdly, about investments or other matters? Jensen nodded, a glint of admiration in his eyes at her perception. Yesterday afternoon, came in with elaborate plans for a mining operation north of here. Wanted me to not only invest myself, but to introduce him to other forward-thinking businessmen in the area. He snorted. I've been in the West long enough to recognize a confident scheme when I see one. Told him I keep my money in cattle and dry goods, not holes in the ground. How did he react? Keegan asked, trying to gauge his father's state of mind from his responses. Took it well enough on the surface, Jensen replied, but there was something in his eyes I didn't care for. Man's not used to being refused, I'd wager. That aligned with Keegan's own assessment of his father. Tobias McCoy had always considered rejection a personal affront rather than a simple business setback. It was what made him dangerous, his tendency to take opposition as a challenge to be overcome by any means necessary. What about his associates? Abigail asked, the men who arrived with him. Jensen's expression grew more serious. That's where things get concerning. They've been making trips to neighboring settlements, returning with more men. Carter down at the livery says there are now at least 8 of them staying at various boarding houses around town. All hard-looking characters, well armed. The implication was clear, and it sent a chill through Keegan. 1 or 2 drifters passing through a frontier town raised no eyebrows. 8 or more gathering in a small settlement like Bitterroot suggested organization and purpose, the kind that often ended in violence. You think they're planning something beyond confident schemes, Keegan said. It wasn't a question. Jensen nodded grimly. Bitterroot's small, but we've got a bank now, businesses with cash on hand, regular shipments of goods and funds moving through. Wouldn't be the first time a gang decided a growing frontier town was ripe for picking. But that would be open outlawry, Abigail protested. Surely my father wouldn't risk, she stopped, realizing the naivety of her own statement. Of course he would, if he felt cornered or challenged enough. Keegan reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. My father started as a confidence man, but he's not above more direct methods when schemes fail. The stage robbery wasn't his only violent enterprise. He turned back to Jensen. Has the town got any defense against something like this? A sheriff, a marshal? Sheriff's 2 days ride away in the county seat, Jensen replied. We've got Peterson as town constable, but he's more suited to breaking up Saturday night fights than facing down a gang of hardened outlaws. And most of the men in town are shopkeepers or farmers, decent with rifles for hunting, maybe, but not gunfighters. The picture Jensen painted was bleak, but not surprising. Many frontier towns existed in a precarious balance, their growth outpacing their ability to provide adequate protection for their citizens and businesses. It was precisely this vulnerability that made them attractive targets for men like Tobias and his associates. We need to prepare, Keegan said decisively. Warn the bank, organize the men who can fight, perhaps send for the sheriff. Already done, Jensen assured him. Sent a rider yesterday when I first noticed the additional men arriving. Sheriff promised to come as soon as he can, but he's dealing with trouble over in Sweetwater. Could be days before he gets here. He leaned forward, his expression grave. In the meantime, I've quietly spread the word to keep valuables secure and to be ready for trouble. But we can't put the town on full alert based just on suspicion. Might precipitate the very violence we're trying to prevent if McCoy and his men feel cornered. Or it might convince them to move on to an easier target, Abigail suggested hopefully. Jensen shook his head. Don't think it's that simple anymore, Miss Gardner. This has become personal for Tobias McCoy. He's not just after money now. He wants to hurt his son to prove something. He glanced at Keegan with genuine sympathy. Man's got a darkness in him that goes beyond ordinary greed. I've seen his type before. Keegan couldn't disagree with Jensen's assessment. His father's bitterness had been festering for years, fed by failures and disappointments, by the persistent belief that the world had cheated him of his due. In Tobias's twisted perspective, Keegan's rejection of his way of life wasn't just a son's choice to follow a different path. It was a betrayal, a judgment, a living reminder of his own moral failures. "So what do we do?" Abigail asked practically. "Cancel the wedding, leave town temporarily." "No," Keegan said firmly, the idea crystallizing even as he spoke. "We proceed exactly as planned. The wedding happens in 4 days, just as we've arranged, but we use it." "Use it?" Jensen echoed, raising an eyebrow. "How so?" "Most of the town will be there," Keegan explained, the strategy taking shape in his mind. "Everyone gathered in one place with Peterson and other capable men present. If my father is planning something significant, a bank robbery, a raid on businesses, he'd likely time it for when the town is distracted." Jensen nodded slowly, following his logic. "So we appear to proceed normally, but actually set a trap. Let them think we're all at the church, while in reality we're ready for them," Keegan finished, "with men positioned at likely targets prepared to defend the town." It was a risky plan, one that placed both their wedding day and potentially the entire town in the middle of a confrontation with dangerous men. But it also offered the best chance to protect Bitterroot while ending his father's threat decisively. Abigail's expression was troubled as she considered the proposal. "What about your father specifically?" "He'll be expected at the wedding as your family. If he's not there, it could raise suspicion." "He'll be there," Keegan said with certainty. "Whatever broader scheme he's planning with his associates, he won't miss the opportunity to witness what he sees as my comeuppance, whether through public revelation of my past or through some more direct intervention at the ceremony itself." "You think he'd actually disrupt your wedding?" Jensen asked, sounding both appalled and grimly fascinated. "His own son's marriage." "I think he'd consider it poetic justice," Keegan replied honestly. "A public humiliation to match what he perceives as my rejection of him." The three sat in silence for a moment, contemplating the distorted family dynamics that had led to this point. Then Abigail straightened, her expression resolute. "Well then," she said briskly, "we'd better make sure our wedding is memorable for all the right reasons, hadn't we? If Tobias McCoy wants a performance, let's give him one he'll never forget." Her determination in the face of such circumstances filled Keegan with a fierce pride and love. This remarkable woman, who could have chosen a safe and comfortable life in Boston, was instead standing beside him ready to face down a gang of potential outlaws on what should have been the most joyous day of their lives. "You're sure about this?" he asked her softly. "It's not too late to postpone, to wait until the danger has passed." Abigail's smile was both tender and steely. "Keegan McCoy, I've waited my entire life to find someone worth building a future with. I'm not delaying that future by a single day because of your father's bitterness." She turned to Jensen. "Now, let's plan how to protect our town while still having a beautiful wedding, shall we?" Jensen's weathered face split into an admiring grin. "Yes, ma'am, I believe we shall." As they began to outline their strategy, Keegan felt a curious mixture of dread and hope. The coming days would bring danger and possibly violence, but they would also bring his marriage to this extraordinary woman. Whatever else happened, that truth would sustain him through the confrontation that loomed ahead. The wedding preparations proceeded with an outward appearance of normality that belied the undercurrents of tension running through Bitterroot. Abigail continued her final days of teaching, while simultaneously overseeing the decoration of the church and the arrangement of the modest celebration that would follow the ceremony. Keegan drove his workers harder than ever on the schoolhouse, determined to have the building weather-tight and secure before his wedding day. Beneath this veneer of ordinary activity, however, the town was quietly preparing for possible violence. Jensen had convened a secret meeting of the most capable men in Bitterroot, outlining the potential threat and organizing them into groups that would be strategically positioned on the wedding day. The bank manager had moved most of his cash reserves to a hidden location, leaving only enough in the vault to avoid raising suspicion. Shopkeepers had taken similar precautions with their valuables. Meanwhile, Tobias and his growing band of associates maintained their own deceptive normalcy. They drank in the saloons,
engaged in apparently casual conversations with locals, and made occasional trips to neighboring settlements. To the untrained eye, they appeared to be nothing more than a group of drifters and prospectors passing time while planning their next venture. But Keegan, watching from a distance, recognized the patterns of men preparing for action. The way they studied the town's layout, noting the positions of businesses and the routines of their owners. The subtle signals they exchanged when certain topics arose in conversation. The careful inventory they seemed to be taking of Bitterroot's defenses, or lack thereof. Most telling was his father's continued campaign of insinuation and doubt regarding Keegan's character. Tobias had expanded his audience beyond the town's influential citizens to include ordinary residents, shopkeepers, and ranchers. Anyone who might be inclined to question the wisdom of trusting a former drifter with their schoolhouse and their teacher. The strategy was having an effect, though not perhaps the one Tobias had intended. Rather than turning the entire town against Keegan, it had created a division. Some residents, particularly those who had worked most closely with him or who knew him best, stood firmly in his defense. Others, especially those already predisposed to distrust outsiders, began to regard him with suspicion. This split became evident 2 days before the wedding, when Keegan arrived at the schoolhouse to find Peterson, the town constable, waiting for him. The older man's expression was troubled as he fingered the tarnished badge pinned to his vest. "McCoy," he began awkwardly, "need to have a word with you, official-like." Keegan nodded, gesturing for his workers to continue without him. "What can I do for you, constable?" Peterson shuffled uncomfortably. "Been hearing things. Concerning things about your past. Ordinarily, I don't put much stock in gossip, but when it comes from a man's own father." He trailed off, clearly uncertain how to proceed. "My father has his own reasons for speaking against me," Keegan said evenly. "None of them honorable." "That may be," Peterson acknowledged, "but I've got responsibilities to this town. Need to know if there's any truth to these stories about stage robberies, confident schemes, that sort of business." Keegan straightened, meeting the constable's gaze without flinching. "My father is a con man, constable. I won't deny that, and when I was a boy I was dragged along on his travels. But I never participated in his crimes, and I left him the moment I was big enough to fight back." He gestured to the half-finished schoolhouse around them. "This is who I am now. The work I do, the life I'm building, this is the truth. The rest is just a shadow from a life I left behind 8 years ago." Peterson studied him for a long, silent minute, his eyes searching Keegan's face for any sign of deception. Finally, he let out a grunt and released his badge. "That's what I figured," he said gruffly. "Just needed to hear you say it." He glanced toward the street where Tobias had been holding court. "Man comes into town, starts spreading poison about his own flesh and blood. That says more about him than it does about you, son." Keegan felt a knot of tension loosen in his chest. "So you're not here to arrest me?" "Arrest you?" Peterson chuckled dryly. "For what, building a school, loving the teacher?" He shook his head. "No, I'm here to tell you that Jensen's plan is in place. And to tell you that when trouble starts, and I reckon it will, you won't be standing alone." He clapped a heavy hand on Keegan's shoulder. "We protect our own in Bitterroot, McCoy. And like it or not, you're one of us now." The morning of the wedding dawned bright and clear, the Wyoming sky a vast, unblemished blue. The air was filled with the scent of sage, and the wildflowers that Abigail and the town's women had used to transform the weathered church into a sanctuary of color and celebration. Keegan stood at the altar, his heart hammering against the ribs of his best suit. Beside him, Sam Jensen stood as his best man, a silent, reassuring presence. The church was packed, not just with friends, but with nearly every soul in Bitterroot. To an outsider, it looked like a touching display of community support. To Keegan, scanning the faces of the men sitting near the windows and doors, it looked like a regiment standing to arms. Then the organ music began, Mrs. Palmer playing in Abigail's stead, and the doors opened. Abigail appeared, and for a moment the danger, his father, and the uncertain future all vanished. She was radiant in a dress of cream-colored silk, altered from one her mother had sent from Boston. She carried a bouquet of prairie roses, but it was her smile that held Keegan captive. It was a smile of absolute confidence, of joy that refused to be dimmed by fear. As she reached his side, she squeezed his hand. "Ready," she whispered. "Always," he breathed. Reverend Palmer cleared his throat, opening his Bible. dearly beloved, we are gathered here today. The ceremony proceeded with a solemn beauty that brought tears to Mrs. Jensen's eyes. But just as the Reverend reached the question of objections, the heavy double doors at the back of the church banged open. "I object." The voice boomed through the sanctuary, theatrical and mocking. Every head turned. Tobias McCoy stood in the doorway, flanked by his 3 associates. They weren't dressed for a wedding. They wore long dusters, and their hands hovered near the guns at their hips. "This marriage is a fraud," Tobias declared, striding down the center aisle, his boots loud on the wooden floor. "Just like the groom." Keegan stepped in front of Abigail, shielding her. "This isn't the time, Father." "It's the perfect time," Tobias sneered. He stopped 10 feet from the altar, his men fanning out behind him. "Did you really think you could play the respectable citizen, boy? Did you think I'd let you forget where you came from?" He turned to the congregation, his voice rising. "This man is a thief, a liar. And since he refused to pay his family debts, I'm afraid I'll have to collect them from this town myself." He signaled to his men. "All right, boys, collect the tithe, watches, jewelry, cash. Consider it a wedding gift." One of the men drew his revolver. "Now," Keegan shouted. The reaction was instantaneous. Sam Jensen whistled, sharp and loud. In the pews, 20 men stood up simultaneously, shedding the coats they had draped over their laps to reveal shotguns and repeaters leveled directly at Tobias and his gang. At the same time, the side doors of the church burst open, and Constable Peterson stepped in with 4 deputies from the county seat, who had arrived under cover of darkness the night before. "Drop him," Peterson roared. Tobias froze, his hand halfway to his weapon. He looked around the church, his eyes widening as he realized the trap. He wasn't facing a room of terrified sheep, he was facing a fortress. "It's over, Tobias," Keegan said, his voice steady and cold. "Bitterroot isn't the kind of town you can bully, and I'm not the scared boy you used to lock in a room." Tobias looked at the wall of guns aimed at him. He looked at his son, standing tall and unafraid. And finally he looked at his associates, who were slowly raising their hands, realizing they had been hopelessly outmaneuvered. With a snarl of frustration, Tobias let his hand fall away from his gun. "Take them," Peterson ordered. As the deputies moved in to cuff the men, dragging them out of the sanctuary, Tobias stopped as he passed Keegan. For a moment the mask of the confidence man dropped completely, leaving only a bitter, defeated old man. "You think you've won," Tobias hissed. "You're still a McCoy, it's in the blood. You'll destroy this, just like I destroyed everything." Keegan looked at Abigail, who was watching him with fierce pride. He looked at the townspeople who had stood up to defend him. "I'm not you," Keegan said softly. "I never was." He turned his back on his father. "Reverend, I believe we were interrupted." A cheer went up from the congregation that shook the rafters. "I now pronounce you man and wife." The words were spoken, the kiss exchanged, and the celebration that followed was perhaps the most raucous and joyful in the history of the territory. The tension of the standoff dissolved into pure relief and happiness. Fiddles played, food was devoured, and the story of the wedding day ambush was told and retold, growing more heroic with each repetition. Keegan and Abigail slipped away just as the sun began to set, painting the vast Wyoming sky in strokes of violet and gold. They walked to the edge of town, to the foundation of the new schoolhouse. "We did it," Abigail said, leaning her head on his shoulder. "We actually did it." "We did," Keegan agreed, wrapping his arms around her. "Though I hope the rest of our marriage is a little more peaceful." Abigail laughed, the sound clear and musical. "I make no promises, but at least we know we can handle the storms." She looked at the frame of the building he was raising for her. "It's going to be beautiful, Keegan." "It will be," he promised. "Windows facing the mountains, a sturdy roof, and plenty of room for a piano." "And a home," she added softly, "for us." Keegan looked out at the horizon. The road that had brought him here stretched away into the distance, the same road he had traveled alone for so long, but he felt no pull to follow it anymore. The restlessness was gone, replaced by a deep, abiding anchor. "Yes," he said, kissing the top of her head as the first stars appeared. "A home." Epilogue 5 years later. 1883. The whistle of the steam engine echoed through the valley as the train pulled into the new Bitterroot station. The town had grown just as Jensen had predicted. There were brick buildings now, a second hotel, and bustling streets. but the heart of the town remained the white schoolhouse behind the livery. Inside, the afternoon light streamed through the large windows, illuminating the rows of desks where children bent over their slates. At the front of the room, a woman with honey-blonde hair sat at a polished upright piano, her fingers moving gracefully over the keys. The music drifted out the open windows, floating across the schoolyard to where a man was finishing the frame for a new addition to the building, a library. Keegan McCoy paused in his work, wiping sweat from his brow. He was broader now, the lean look of the trail replaced by the solid strength of a builder. He rested his hammer on his belt and listened. It was a nocturne, the same one that had stopped him in the street 5 years ago. He smiled, a look of profound contentment settling over his face. A small boy, perhaps 4 years old with dark hair and his mother's green eyes, ran out of the schoolhouse door, clutching a wooden horse Keegan had carved for him. "Papa, Mama is playing your song." Keegan scooped his son up, swinging him onto his shoulders. "I hear it, Sam, I hear it." He walked toward the schoolhouse, toward the music, toward the woman who had turned a drifter into a man with a home. The West was still wild, the world still uncertain, but as long as the music played, Keegan knew exactly where he belonged.